All right, we're rolling. I'm here with Steve Kusaba, who has a grand project. You want to tell me about it?
Yes, this project is a 47-hour Omni musical, and has some key themes in it. And one of the, it's about the advent of life and man, and the rights of man, and the reverence toward life. Because it examines the modern ruling structures and how they interact with people. And it mostly has sort of a message of hope, where that in some place people might be able to live freely and not be so stifled by the ruling class.
Great clock, synchronizing bell, ring and the parts all move. True clock, mystifying tell, clue if it's dark or light. Send all the players hurrying to go, view all the layers and labyrinth below. Moving as if it's from a single thought, gears in the great saw's clock. Great and mighty clock, synchronizing bell, ring and the parts all move. Great and mighty clock, mystifying tell, clue if it's dark or light. 2 or million, rational or not, no reptilian impulses forgot. Follow instincts, folly to fall, gears in the great saw's claw.
And what's the name of this project?
It's the centrifugal Zot's clock.
So, would you characterize it as a political work?
It's very political and very spiritual in a sense.
Spectacular sounds that come out of this music. I had to listen to him do it, and I said, man, I know where he's coming from. But you know what? It's strange but powerful. It's like, wow, I'm in. It's all good. There's plenty more I think I need to listen to over and over again.
There's filming done about the movie, and so it's all underway.
Centrifugal clock. Great clock, synchronizing bell, ring and the parts all move. True clock, mystifying tell, clue if it's dark or light. Send all the players hurrying to go, view all the layers and labyrinth below. Moving as if it's from a single thought, gears in the great saw's clock. Great and mighty clock, synchronizing bell, ring and the parts all move. Great and mighty clock, mystifying tell, clue if it's dark or light. 2 or million, rational or not, no reptilian impulses forgot. Follow instincts, folly to fraud, gears in the great saw's clock.
I am the camp doctor.
Well, here we are. Dave is making another movie about media. Well, let's roll it back right now. Let's get to the bottom of just one tiny aspect of this. And let's go back to when America was founded.
From the earliest days, freedom of the press was what defined America. Thomas Jefferson, who helped write the Declaration of Independence, believed a free media was essential for a free nation, saying, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter."
The United States was in many senses founded by a journalist, Tom Paine, who called Americans to revolution against a British Empire that was thought to be completely unbeatable. This country was really founded on the concept that if you gave citizens the information they needed, they could govern themselves.
You could be there and you would be a free man. If you weren't a slave, that is. They did have slaves, so you could do any darn fool thing you wanted to. Now, how did we get to the transition to a nation that reveres the most loathsome authoritarianism of communist nations? Well, this is a very sordid and ugly tale. The whole criminal affair and its pathetic path, where the corporate media has been selling out the public for over a century now, and they're currently doing it now, unfolded on a very predictable path. But what's interesting is how media, not only did it use its news segments to promote these falsehoods, but they also, what they did was they used entertainment all along. I mean, you go way back, Dragnet was a walking commercial for government authoritarianism.
You got nice eyes for a cop.
And I'll bet your mother had a loud bark.
For the destruction of the Bill of Rights, which ultimately the drug war has pretty much made the Bill of Rights a dead letter. It's pretty useless with all the codes that they have passed. But it's what they do in their entertainment propaganda field. They abuse terminology. So, for instance, they refer to all drugs as narcotics, which has a dual semantic accomplishment in that real narcotics are they're considered just bad. They have no redeeming purpose. Never mind, that there are circumstances when they do. Get cancer sometime. You'll love them. They're the best thing ever. But the thing is then they imply when they talk about weed, they call it a narcotic, right? Because then they're taking these addictive substances and superimposing them on weed. And they're superimposing them on the entire range of substances, which, by the way, there is no official list. You're supposed to never do any substances that there's code for, but they won't ever print a list. They don't want to print a list because then you'll know how ridiculous it is and how wrong-headed it is and how it should have never been. Never mind the fact that there shouldn't be an illegal substance because it's your body. If you don't control your own body, you're a slave. But, that list, that big controlled substance list, at one point, things come on it, things go off of it. And the thing of it is that one time this particular drug, you'll go to jail over it because you're abusing narcotics. But then it's over the counter because, after all, it was an antihistamine. So you needed to go to jail when, your hay fever got a little bad and you wanted to dry your nose up a little bit. Well, they need to fill the jails because, well, that's how they make their money. So this is all ridiculous. And does your regular media ever talk about this? Do they ever really go into detail and point this stuff out? No. And the entertainment is always showing people being arrested over substances. Being arrested for weed and things far more benign than weed you can be arrested for. And these television shows all think that's okay.
I'll tell you what I know. I know that, in fact, too many kids that begin with pot end up with heroin, then on to LSD.
You could put tomato as a controlled substance, and then they talk about it as the tomato will just take your life down.
Even the mere mention of the word is sufficient to induce panic.
Tomato.
They're basically trying to imply that the worst of the most addictive substances, that's really all we're talking about here. But yet under the code, everything is shoved into it. Be free. Reinstate the Bill of Rights. Reinstate your humanity. And that's what we should do. That's what and we should unravel this terrible, terrible authoritarian system that oppresses people the way that it does and destroys so many lives.
Obviously, there's a real seduction to stupidity. I guess it's the unwritten truth. That's what Hollywood actors in particular are ideally supposed to be, are blank slates. The majority of them have never finished high school, including people you would think, considering their image, would have, like people like Uma Thurman, never finished high school. She has a academic father, but there you are. It's mostly they're discovered, like Keanu Reeves, people like that. It's why part of the time they sort of foster a fake kind of book learning. It's why you'll find them in Vanity Fair and the thing Celebrity Bookshelf. What am I reading now? And it's usually something metaphysical because they don't have the discipline of mind to separate, things that are rubbish. And if you think about it, what is the age that you need to get discovered by? You need to be a teenager. So you really don't have time to finish your BA and then go off to Europe. You're going to be getting kind of long in the tooth by the time you come back and you're ready for your close-up in Maxim.
One of the interesting things about the new divisions of network media are the entertainers turned information experts. And one of the ones that's really funny to me, well, look, I like these guys, they're fun comedians. Like, take 3 of them. They're truly network, self-assigned news people. They go over the news and they tell you how it is. So Steve Colbert, Bill Maher, and John Oliver. And I've watched a lot of what they put out. They're good comedians. I like a lot of what they do. I really like them. I think they're great guys. But they talk a lot of BS all the time too. They're clueless about certain things, and they're just the level of cluelessness is very high. And so, but we watch them because they're funny, and we really want to be entertained, and they're good at that. But some people actually watch them to figure out what's going on, and I say, well, this is a sad sort of a thing. Let's just take, for instance, John Oliver. And he's just really ridiculously funny. After you have to suffer through his his Brexit shows and stuff. These guys, there's kind of a theme in these shows that they show people saying dumb things that are pro-Brexit, and that's like that. And this is why you shouldn't be for Brexit. They don't talk about any of the subject matter. They don't present two sides. It has nothing to do with news. It's them sort of just sloppily telling you to believe a certain thing because we say so, And anyway, and the thing is, John Oliver is one of the funniest people on the earth. really, after Bill Burr and Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock and Ricky Gervais and the Dice Man and Tina Fey and some others, he's one of the funniest people in the world. So when he talks about banking, it's like him and Bill Maher try their hardest to see who can be the most bungling of the two. Sometimes I just go, I'm not sure. But John Oliver made a strong, bid, by having, he had this guy, he said, the experts say that throughout the decades, people, they don't understand why interest rates have been steadily going down. They've been trending down. Nobody understands. We got this guy right here, and he's from the World Bank, and he said, we don't know why. So that's it. Experts say, we don't know why. And he goes, no, you win. Bill Maher's got, Bill Maher, when he was talking about how TARP got paid off and then sort of leaving out all the other stuff that was happening at the same time, which would show that TARP really, technically, did not get paid off. But really, Bill Maher has not achieved this level of bungletude. And of course, anybody that understands that interest rates are no longer a market force. So it doesn't tell us anything. It just tells us what central banks have wanted to do, and central banks do what butters their bread and the people that hire them want. And obviously, what do they want? They want low interest rates, printing money. And they only put, and then, this is why that's trending. But anyway, it's like when he puts it out there, and we're supposed to know. He's right. Nobody knows. And the thing is keep watching the entertainers. So it's like double laughs. Like, they are funny. They tell really good jokes constantly. They have good material. They deliver them really well, Really, John Oliver is really special in his delivery. He is really good. Not as good as Bill Burr, not as good as Dave Chappelle, but some other people. But it's good. It's good. It's funny.
A warning. What you are about to see is not for the faint-hearted.
You see, in the National Theatre of Hungary in Budapest, all the great character parts are played by 4 or 5 different players. Each competes with the other. Each plays the part in accordance with their own conception. And the audience is just as much interested in the actor's conception of the role than it's interested in the play itself.
Well, why did you leave Hungary?
Political reasons. After the war, I participated in the revolution, and later, I found myself on the wrong side.
Mr. Lugosi, what was your first mystery play?
It was Dracula.
Or did the role depress you?
Very much. It haunted me. I often dreamed of the dead. In the morning when I woke up, I was tired.
My name is Igor. You see that? They hanged me once, Langstein. They broke my neck. They said I was dead. They threw me in here long ago. They wouldn't bury me in holy place like churchyard. So, Igor is dead.
On this day guess it's time to fight, not run away.
How's the test there, Herman? Okay. Mr. Lugosi, let's start over again. Mr. Lugosi, you're leaving the state hospital tomorrow.
Yes, I'm very happy I do, on account that I became a new man, new lease of life. I'm cured.
You're cured?
Yes, I'm very grateful to the state hospital that they allowed me and took me when I volunteered. You see, previously I was in a private sanatorium, but they weren't as strict, so I was afraid it was going to take too long. But now we made a short cut. It was very...
How long have you been in the institution, Mr. Lugosi?
3 months.
3 months.
Because 90 days is the state law. It's minimum.
And you feel like your old self again.
I feel like $1 million.
You feel like practically really felt, huh?
Sure.
That is best.
I'm looking forward to work again.
I understand that.
I had an assignment playing the star part in The Guru Goes West. Yes, and Eddie Woods will be the producer in that.
You'll handle that as soon as you leave there.
Surely.
Well, that's fine. How did you ever happen to get on narcotics, let's put it bluntly?
Oh, I had a very painful ailment. My sciatic nerves bothered me terribly. I suffered very much, so I went to the doctor and he gave me some narcotics to kill the pain. It happened about every week once, and it helped me so much, it put me so much in a good state of feeling that I used it later myself, even if I didn't have pain.
Did you ever have any trouble getting it?
No, because the doctor prescribed it. I didn't buy it on the black market.
But you were able, if you had wished to, you could have bought it on the black market as well.
I could have, but I didn't need it.
Yes,
it would cost too much money, and so I got it, really, it doesn't cost me much than more than
excuse me, you had other worries as well as narcotics at one time, in the last few years. You had domestic.
Yes, domestic problems.
Alcohol, I believe.
Alcohol, domestic problem. I had a very young wife. She was 30 years younger than I, and she felt that perhaps she has a right to be happy, not to be chained to an old man.
I wouldn't say that. What about your alcoholic situation?
I kicked it off 3 years ago.
You have been away from it 3 years?
Yes, I joined Alcoholics Anonymous and I gave it up.
I see. Well, you're certainly looking fine. What advice, if you had just say another half a minute on this good telenews air here, what would you say to the people who are either on narcotics, have been on it, or even would ever consider going to their first part?
Well, with those who are on it, I would really suggest that they should go right away and report their volunteer to a state hospital and get cured.
Whatever state they're in.
Yes, whatever state they're in. Or to go to a federal hospital. And for those who are just in danger, I would say they should be very careful, should pray, and shouldn't start it, because it's a terrible ordeal to go through a withdrawal. It's the greatest pain in the world.
And Dracula was nothing compared to that. Nice to see you looking so well, and the best of success. Get back in the films.
I appreciate it.
We want to see you back in your fans.
I'm looking forward to seeing my fans again in my next picture.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
They die dead. I die live.
I got this guitar guitar tuner, really good guitar tuner. And the other day I was tuning my guitar, and a letter fell out. It was from outer space. I don't know how to explain it. So these letters have been coming out. And I'm going to share this one with you. They're very thoughtful letters. This one is from someone who doesn't want to see America collapse morally and spiritually and economically the way it is collapsing. This is what he says. Listen, he says that wealthy people have bought the media and control the government. And he says it didn't cost them much money to do that. You know, it was a bargain. And now use the media and government to colonize our minds. Okay, so he says, please understand that when I say your minds are being colonized, I'm not saying you are mental zombies obedient to external commands. Colonization is more subtle than that. It works by manipulating your basic assumptions, the mental constructs that operate beneath your threshold of awareness and shape what you deem as natural, normal, and inevitable. Okay, so the colonized mind is one that has its basic assumptions of what's natural. What goes without saying is manipulated. These assumptions have to do with the way you look at things, not at the things you see, given the way you look. For example, without really thinking about it, you probably accept as natural that someone with lots of money would have more privileges, power, and protection, even more health care. This is not a conclusion, but a colonized assumption. It is not what you think, but how you've been colonized to think. Now, if you want to know what kind of world you're being colonized for, look at your pay-or-die healthcare system. Note how you've been colonized to accept as normal the notion that healthcare is a business for profit, and reject as extremist the notion that healthcare is a human right. Note how these notions seem obvious. If you look carefully, however, you will see they are manipulated assumptions of a colonized mind, not the independent conclusions of a thinking person or the moral mandates of an ethical person. You see, healthcare is a human right, and the provision of it universally is the bare minimum of civilized existence. This is why, to save your country, you will not only have to impeach those who have turned your government into a pay-as-you-go cash register for special interests, but also cleanse your own minds of the corporate assumptions that now filter and shape how you see the world. This won't be easy. Look at how they colonize conservatism, changing it from a philosophy based on respect for law, tradition, and reason into a radical right-wing ideology that functions as a base of support not only for the unchecked power and unlimited privileges of corporations, but for military imperialism as well.
This is the story of a 30-year search by U.S. intelligence agencies to perfect mind control. This is the story of the search for mind control. ABC News Close-Up, Mission Mind Control.
1217, now boarding at 8.
Mark? Anne. It's been ages.
Can I buy you?
Allow me.
This seal is a symbol of good television. It signifies that KNBC observes the high standards of programming and advertising recommended by the Television Code of the National Association of Broadcasters. To see better TV, watch Channel 4, a TV code station.
Propaganda by Edward Bernays, published in 1928. Chapter 1. Organizing Chaos. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. Our invisible governors are, in many cases, unaware of the identity of their fellow members in the inner cabinet. They govern us by their qualities of natural leadership, their ability to supply needed ideas, and by their key position in the social structure. Whatever attitude one chooses to take towards this condition, it remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small numbers of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. It is not usually realized how necessary these invisible governors are to the orderly function of our group life. In theory, every citizen makes up his mind on public questions and matters of private conduct. In practice, if all men had to study for themselves the abstruse economic, political, and ethical data involved in every question, they would find it impossible to come to a conclusion about anything. We have voluntarily agreed to let an invisible government sift the data and high-spot the outstanding issues so that our field of choice shall be narrowed to practical proportions. From our leaders in the media they use to reach the public, we accept the evidence and the demarcation of issues bearing upon public questions. From some ethical teacher, be it a minister, a favorite essayist, or merely prevailing opinion, we accept a standardized code of social conduct to which we conform most of the time. In theory, everybody buys the best and cheapest commodities offered him on the market. In practice, if everyone went around pricing and chemically testing before purchasing the dozens of soaps or fabrics or brands of bread which are for sale, economic life will become hopelessly jammed. To avoid such confusion, society consents to have its choice narrowed to ideas and objects brought to its attention through propaganda of all kinds. There is consequently a vast and continuous effort going on to capture our minds in the interest of some policy or commodity or idea. It might be better to have, instead of propaganda and special pleading, committees of wise men who would choose our rulers, dictate our conduct, private and public, and decide upon the best types of clothes for us to wear and the best kinds of food for us to eat. But we have chosen the opposite method, that of open competition. We must find a way to make free competition function with reasonable smoothness. To achieve this, society has consented to permit free competition to be organized by leadership and propaganda. Some of the phenomenon of this process are criticized: the manipulation of news, the inflation of personality, and the general ballyhoo by which politicians and commercial products and social ideas are brought to the consciousness of the masses. The instruments by which public opinion is organized and focused may be misused, but such organization and focusing are necessary to ordinary life. As civilization has become more complex, and as the need for invisible government has been increasingly demonstrated, the technical means have been invented and developed by which opinion may be regimented. With the printing press and the newspaper, the railroad, the telephone, telegraph, radios, and airplanes, ideas can be spread rapidly and even instantaneously over the whole of America. H.G. Wells senses the vast potentialities of these inventions when he writes in the New York Times. Modern means of communication, the power afforded by print, telephone, wireless, and so forth, of rapidly putting through directive strategic or technical conception to a great number of cooperating centers, of getting quick replies and effective discussion, have opened up a new world of political processes. Ideas and phrases could now be given an effectiveness greater than the effectiveness of any personality and stronger than any sectional interest. The common design can be documented and sustained against perversion and betrayal. It can be elaborated and developed steadily and widely without personal, local, and sectional misunderstanding." End quote. What Mr. Wells says of political processes is equally true of commercial and social processes and all manifestations of mass activity. The groupings and affiliations of society today are no longer subject to local and sectional limitations. When the Constitution was adopted, the unit of organization was the village community, which produced the greater part of its own necessary commodities and generated its group ideas and opinions by personal contact and discussion directly amongst its citizens. But today, because ideas can be instantaneously transmitted to any distance and to any number of people, this geographical integration has been supplemented by many other kinds of grouping, so that persons having the same ideas and interests may be associated and regimented for common action even though they live thousands of miles apart. It is extremely difficult to realize how many and diverse all the cleavages in our society. They may be social, political, economic, racial, religious, or ethical, with hundreds of subdivisions of each. The invisible intertwining structure of groupings and association is the mechanism by which democracy has organized its group mind and simplified its mass thinking. To deplore the existence of such a mechanism is to ask for a society such as never was and never will be. To admit that it exists, but expect that it shall not be used is unreasonable. Emil Ludwig represents Napoleon as, quote-unquote, ever on the watch for indication of public opinion, always listening to the voice of the people, a voice which defies calculation. "Do you know," he said in those days, "what amazes me more than all else? The impotence of force to organize anything." End quote. It is the purpose of this book to explain the structure of the mechanisms which control the public mind, and to tell how it is manipulated by the special pleader who seeks to create public acceptance for a particular idea or commodity. It will attempt at the same time to find the due place in the modern democratic scheme for this new propaganda, and to suggest its gradually evolving code of ethics and practice.
Stand by for the opening night of the National Television Service.
Hello there, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and children.
Hello, I'm Joel Aldrin, and this film is about advertising. The reason I'm here is because I feel pretty strongly about the contribution advertising makes to the strength of our country. Now, as you know, advertising means different things to different people. And here's a good illustration of what I mean.
Bread. Seems I got hung up with a few more necessaries instead. Well, I guess that's kind of funny. I better see if I got the money. Sometimes, you know, I wonder what's going on in my head.
Senator Philip Hart made an estimate that in 1969, out of the $780 billion spent by consumers, $200 billion received no value.
I've got consumer power. I've got consumer power. Consumer power. Consumer power.
Manufacturers came into being into a competitive environment, wanted to increase and enlarge the volume of the sales of their products. And so they looked around and they said, why don't we communicate with the people in large volume about our product and try to do it persuasively. So they called in or created advertising. Advertising didn't create the present business system. The present business system really created advertising or caused it to come into being. I think it's important that we do make that distinction.
Businessmen will admit that. They make between people's needs and people's wants. And the function of advertising for most products is to create wants, create a desire for wants beyond people's elementary needs, such as basic foodstuffs.
I think it's highly possible that advertising encourages people to consume more than they actually need for survival. I don't think there's any question about that. But I am not sure that all by itself is indeed a bad thing. There's no question in my mind that advertising stimulates, and that's really what it's all about. But I don't think that's all that bad. To want more, to work for more, and to have a better standard of living as a result is not that much of a subject, I think, for just ridicule.
For example, when they're really not selling the product, they're selling sexual attractiveness, such as toothpaste ads. They're selling career advancement, such as if you don't use the proper mouthwash, you might not get promoted in your job, or you might turn off your superiors.
Actually, I feel that a heavy percentage of people are really not against advertising per se, although they speak as if they are. But rather are they against advertising which is unattractive, boring, or in bad taste, or obviously misleading.
Just watch some of the television ads. Watch the techniques that are used, you know, like the pain relievers and the pills going down this silhouette of a person into the person's stomach. Or you see statements as most doctors agree, or most doctors use, or a famous hospital study shows a certain diet pill or diet wafer reduces so many pounds per week, and then they have the sort of graphs and the statistics to back it up. But when you try to write to these companies or to these advertising agencies and ask them, in effect, to prove or submit the tests and the data and to name the hospital study and name what doctors were polled, then the answers are, well, that's proprietary information, it's confidential, or it's none of the consumer's business, or we just give this information when the government requests it, or you should rely on the truth of our statements as we give them.
It is illegal to mislead today. The process by which that is nailed is laborious, perhaps, but it is illegal to deceive or mislead in advertising.
People might be inclined to say, so what?
If you were to follow a busy doctor as he makes his daily round of calls, you'd find yourself having a mighty busy time keeping up with him. Time out for many men of medicine usually means just long enough to enjoy a cigarette. And because they know what a pleasure it is to smoke a mild, good-tasting cigarette, they're particular about the brand they choose. In a repeated national survey, doctors in all branches of medicine, doctors in all parts of the country were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" Once again, the brand named most was Camel. Yes, according to this repeated nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Why not change to Camels for the next 30 days and see what a difference it makes in your smoking enjoyment? See how Camels agree with your throat. See how mild and good tasting a cigarette can be.
all property of all. Your passport is all property of all. Your passport is all property of all. Your passport is all property of all. Words are like our words are like steel. How are we falling here? Because of not before, and now we know. You have your passport in, and now we know. You are really entering, and now we know. Not your paid is a sin, and now we know. How are we falling? We know this song, since half of them are alcoholics. So lost blessed with this condition, now even the agency.
The most famous new market Bernays was asked to uncover was that of women smoking cigarettes in the late 1920s. Up until then, women smoking in public was seen as social taboo. Bernays set about removing this taboo to potentially double tobacco companies' possible clientele. At first he contacted a psychoanalyst to understand the societal perceptions that dissuaded women from smoking. He found that for feminists, cigarettes were like torches of freedom that symbolized their nonconformity and freedom from male oppression. He used this information to formulate a strategy and got a group of stylish women to march in an Easter Day parade. Prior to the parade, he had told the press that a group of women's rights marchers would light torches of freedom. On his cue, the women lit up their cigarettes in front of the eager photographers. The result was press coverage in several major newspapers, including the New York Times, which helped break the taboo against women smoking in public. They were starting to make their own incomes and becoming more independent as a symbolic declaration of their newfound independence. Some women began smoking cigarettes, a behavior typically reserved for men. Smoking was still largely taboo among women and looked down upon by the majority of society, although this dynamic was slowly shifting. At the same time, slim figures were coming into vogue. Cigarette companies wanted to capitalize on both of these trends and win over the female demographic. One business in particular, the American Tobacco Company, hired Edward Bernays to help tap into the burgeoning female market. The president of the American Tobacco Company, George Washington Hill, wanted to make Lucky Strikes his flagship brand of cigarettes popular among women. With the help of Albert Lasker, the American Tobacco Company came up with an ingenious but evil slogan, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet." Bernays was enlisted to help popularize the message that smoking a Lucky as opposed to eating a sweet would help women achieve their ideal figures. Bernays reached out to popular photographers, magazines, and newspapers to help spread the idea that thin figures were indeed the new fashion. He also recruited medical experts to advocate cigarettes as a healthy alternative to eating sweets. Bernays tried to build two key associations in the public mind using propaganda. Being thin is fashionable. Cigarettes help get you thin. The campaign helped increase the amount of women smoking in America, but it still wasn't enough for Hill. He said that women have to become more comfortable smoking indoors, but there was still a taboo around smoking outdoors. Once again, he enlisted Bernays to help solve the dilemma. As we already know, Bernays inherited a love of symbolism from his uncle Freud. More women were already starting to smoke during and after World War I as a symbolic way of challenging male power. Male power. Bernays wanted to capitalize on that trend in the year 1929. He staged a notable event during the Easter Sunday parade in New York that would help popularize smoking cigarettes as a symbol of feminine independence. Several young suffragettes, what we might refer to today as feminists, were hired to publicly smoke cigarettes during the parade. The cigarettes were to be referred to as torches of freedom. Bernays knew that this public declaration of independence and challenge of male power would be eaten up by the press. He even hired his own photographers to make sure that high-quality photos were taken of the momentous occasion. He knew that media coverage would spark a controversial debate in homes and offices all around the country about women smoking. Any female who wanted to partake in the debate and publicly declare her independence could do so by smoking a cigarette. Suffragette? Jet! Woo, woo, woo.
He had, a contract to help increase sales for American tobacco, and one of the most important things that he did to that end was to get Hollywood to incorporate cigarette smoking much more consciously and often artfully into the scenarios of movies, to get them to write cigarette smoking, lighting up and so on, to write all that into the stories, you see. So it developed a kind of, grammar of, seduction, and, you could express various kinds of emotions with cigarettes depending on, who lit you up or whatever. But the point I'm trying to make is that he understood that the inexplicit, kind of inexplicit influence, just creating a large-scale shift in the weather, to get people to do certain things. That was his great insight. What Bernays understood brilliantly was the need to kind of shape the flow of events, to influence the media in a general way, to create an atmosphere in which large numbers of people would end up making certain choices, coming to certain conclusions without really being aware of any stimulus, you see. So he had a lot of contempt for advertising because it was too explicit, it was too blatant, it was saying buy this. I mean, it wasn't quite as simplistic as he made it sound. He badmouthed advertising and disdained it in favor of his own method. It was to kind of create the climate in which people would do certain things to benefit his clients. Propaganda is as American as apple pie. Propaganda at its most sophisticated was perfected, and I mean not just political propaganda, but commercial propaganda. Both kinds of propaganda were perfected jointly by the United States and Britain. In Mein Kampf, Hitler, in his famous chapter on war propaganda, talks about how deeply he admired what a brilliant job the British propagandists had done in World War I, had nothing but contempt for the German propaganda, and resolved to make sure that his own and the Nazi Party's propaganda would be brilliant in imitation of the British, you see?
It's glamorous, colorful, exciting. It's RCA Victor's new Mark Series Color TV, with a picture so bright, so true, you have to see it to believe it. RCA's new high-fidelity color tube, the years ahead tube that sets industry standards. See RCA Victor's new Mark Series Color TV at your dealers this week.
It's here. He's bought it. A brand new RCA Victor Mark 8 Color TV comes to the Jordans. And the whole family gets together.
Now you gotta admit, honey, it's great. Look at that color. The picture sure is brighter now than it was a few years ago.
And look at all the shows of color.
And we got swell black and white pictures, too.
Isn't it great, Mom?
Yes, it's great, all right. Now, can we please go back to color again?
They think there is a choice. The choice is different poisons to use. Which one will leave a bigger bruise? They think there is a choice. They think they have a voice. tells you what to do. Now they can feel more involved. They think there is a choice. They think they have a voice. Issues might leave you confused. It's real clear that you lose. Each one will hurt really bad. Hurt really bad. So long. Each one will hurt really bad. Hurt really bad. So long. And then you'll feel regret. What was I thinking when I did that? Let's walk away. We will not play. We will stay home. They think they have a choice. If only the glass was half full. Twisting through the minefield, I forgot who made our way. The silver lining will inspire us to give up, because each one will hurt really bad. Hurt really bad. And say they think they have a choice. The only choice is to stay away. They think they have a choice. The choice is differing poisons to use. Which one will leave a bigger bruise? They think there is a choice. They think they have a voice. The television tells you what to do. Now they can feel more involved. They think there is a choice. They think they have a voice. Issues might leave you confused. It's real clear that you lose. Each one will hurt really bad. Hurt really bad. So long. Each one will hurt really bad. Hurt really bad. So long. And then you'll feel regret. What was I thinking when I did that?
Now Mark 8 Color TV can be yours for as low as $495.
The most trusted name in television.
We aren't intending to introduce a set at $399.
You can be sure if it's Westinghouse.
Mrs. Cooper, I need help. With all these different dog foods, I don't know what kind to feed him. Dry, soft.
Honey, it's not the form, it's the formula. Those are for any dog, young, old, whatever.
Where's the beef?
Edward L. Bernays, you're the father of public relations. What led you more than 60 years ago to see the need for public relations?
I was a member of the United States Committee on Public Information in World War I, and I worked with the committee to make this the war to end all wars, which was Wilson's idea, and the war to make the world safe for democracy, and to popularize throughout the world the 14 points. And I found that ideas were weapons, and were even more effective than bullets. And first, I called what we did publicity direction. I would direct the conduct of people so that they could win through ideas their public goals. And soon I found out that I could give advice and a person could win his or her goals, whether it was to become an elected official or whether to become the head of a corporation or whether to sell ideas or a product. So I decided that if people wanted to meet their goals, which always depended on the public, that it was basically important to have actions considered as carefully as words. And we changed the name of what we did from publicity direction to counsel, which I took from lawyers, advice on public relations, which really means on their relationships with the public. And since everything in our society depends on the consent of other people than ourselves, it obviously was a field that would help people win their social goal. And one reason why it is so important is that in the United States, every idea that wants to establish itself, whether it's to sell more paper cups that we work with, or to make people more honest or more virtuous, depends on public consent. And so we worked out the engineering of consent, which applies to any social goal, but people who don't have social goals, unfortunately, can also employ it. But we depend upon a democratic public that theoretically and practically wants to be led to where it wants to go.
Here in the United States, we're often brought up and told we don't have propaganda, that we have a hard-charging investigative press, we have this educated, skeptical, even cynical citizenry, and that if there were powerful interests trying to manage and manipulate public opinion, they would be exposed. The reality actually is just the opposite. Academics like Alex Carey and others who've spent their lifetimes looking at how propaganda works finds that it's actually in Western democracies and open societies where you need the most sophisticated sorts of propaganda. And since World War I, thanks to people like Ivy Lee and Eddie Bernays, propaganda has become a business, this business of public relations. Or as one of the firms that has often represented dictators, the Burson Marsteller firm puts it, their business is perception management, to manage public perception, public policy on behalf of their clients, whoever they might be.
On Real People, it's Get Down and Boogie Time with Disco Harry.
Does your husband care about bathroom tissue?
I don't think so.
You've got friends to share the good times, things are going right. And when you're hot and thirsty, it's time.
I mean, is it just because people are lazy today or they're bored? We're bored. We're all bored now.
But has it ever occurred to you, Wally, that the process that creates this boredom that we see in the world now may very well be a self-perpetuating, unconscious form of brainwashing created by a world totalitarian government based on money, and that all of this is much more dangerous than one thinks, and it's not just a question of individual survival, Wally, but that somebody who's bored is asleep, and somebody who's asleep will not say no? See, I keep meeting these people. I mean, just a few days ago, I met this man whom I greatly admire. He's a Swedish physicist, Gustav Bjornstrand, and he told me that he no longer watches television, he doesn't read newspapers, and he doesn't read magazines. He's completely cut them out of his life because he really does feel that we're living in some kind of Orwellian nightmare now, and that everything that you hear now contributes to turning you into a robot. And when I was at Findhorn, I met this extraordinary English tree expert who had devoted his life to saving trees. Just got back from Washington, lobbying to save the redwoods. He's 84 years old. He always travels with a backpack because he never knows where he's going to be tomorrow. And when I met him at Findhorn, he said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "New York." He said, "Ah, New York, yes, that's a very interesting place. Do you know a lot of New Yorkers who keep talking about the fact that they want to leave but never do?" And I said, "Oh, yes." And he said, "Why do you think they don't leave?" I gave him different banal theories. He said, "Oh, I don't think it's that way at all." He said, "I think that New York is the new model for the new concentration camp, where the camp has been built by the inmates themselves, and the inmates are the guards, and they have this pride in this thing they've built. They've built their own prison, and so they exist in a state of schizophrenia, where they are both guards and prisoners, and as a result, they no longer have, having been lobotomized, the capacity to leave the prison they've made, or to even see it as a prison." And then he went into his pocket and he took out a seed for a tree and he said, "This is a pine tree." He put it in my hand and he said, "Escape before it's too late." See, actually for 2 or 3 years now, Chiquita and I have had this very unpleasant feeling that we really should get out. And we really should feel like Jews in Germany in the late 30s. Get out of here. Of course, the problem is where to go, because it seems quite obvious that the whole world is going in the same direction. See, I think it's quite possible that the 1960s represented the last burst of the human being before he was extinguished, and that this is the beginning of the rest of the future now, and that from now on there'll simply be all these robots walking around, feeling nothing, thinking nothing, and there'll be nobody left almost to remind them that there once was a species called a human being, with feelings and thoughts, and that history and memory are right now being erased, and soon nobody will really remember that life existed on the planet.
When a guy uses a quality motor oil, he's saying, "Engine trouble, stay away from my door."
Suspicion on how this all plays, the craft of those few denizens of cable, how they yammer and stammer, now armed with orthodoxy. Reality, it creates opinion. we labor over believed fiction. From the past, the genes we're given were meant to last a part of the hive or the colony. Let's watch cable, how we hammer and stammer now on with orthodoxy. Reality, it creates opinion. It creates opinion for the ones who need a common opinion.
It was here, at the turn of the century, in the town of Ludlow, Colorado, that PR as we know it began to take shape. From the beginning, it was steeped in class warfare. Like workers in most other industries at the time, the coal miners in the town of Ludlow were organizing to win basic rights. In 1914, the United Mine Workers Union called for coal companies to grant safe working conditions, tolerable wages, and compliance with state mining laws. In response, a labor organizer at Ludlow was shot to death by gunmen working for the Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation, owned by the Rockefeller family. John Davidson Rockefeller was America's first billionaire, but it was his son, John D. Jr., who would define the Rockefeller legacy in the 20th century. 24 hours after striking workers and their families celebrated Easter, the end came. It became known as the Ludlow Massacre.
The strike went on from the fall of 1913 to the spring of 1914, and they still couldn't break the strike. The strikers were living in tent colonies set up by their union, the United Mine Workers. And in April of 1914, the National Guard, which at this time was being paid by the Rockefellers, National Guard attacked the tent colony. Men, women, children, killed many people, set the tents afire. They found the next day the bodies of 11 children and 2 women who were burned, suffocated to death in that fire. That was called the Ludlow Massacre.
Following the massacre at Ludlow, soldiers in Denver refused to participate in further attacks against the miners, declaring that they would not engage in the shooting of women and children. Demonstrations erupted across the country. A march occurred in front of the Rockefeller offices in New York City. A clergyman protested outside a church where Rockefeller liked to give sermons, only to be beaten by police. In modern parlance, it was a PR nightmare.
Ivy Lee went to work for, among other clients, the Rockefellers.
Lee began by waging a disinformation campaign. He put out news bulletins claiming that the 2 women and 11 children at Ludlow had not been killed by militia, but by an overturned stove. He circulated stories suggesting that Mother Jones, in addition to being a labor organizer, was a madam who ran a bordello. He ghostwrote letters to the governor and even to President Wilson. Lee's techniques achieved little success, in part because he himself had become a highly visible figure. In future, PR experts would learn that their techniques are rarely effective unless practiced in the dark. Yet one of Lee's innovations was epoch-making. Upon learning that the Rockefeller Foundation had $100 million set aside for promotional purposes, he convinced Rockefeller to donate large sums to colleges, hospitals, churches, and charitable organizations in order to generate positive publicity. He also suggested that Rockefeller Sr. begin handing out money in public and that Jr. appear in staged photo ops at work sites. What Ivy Lee understood was that the corporation needed a makeover. Widely perceived as greedy, tyrannical institutions, corporations needed to manufacture an image of warmth and caring.
Charity and private charity, and you might say government charity, any kind of action that sort of relieves people's distress a little bit without changing the system, maintains the system. In fact, that is the way the American system, which is very exploitative and very unfair, that's the way the American system has been maintained for all these centuries, really, by giving people a little bit and giving enough people, just enough, to prevent them from breaking out in open rebellion.
John Davison Rockefeller Sr., once the world's richest man, was even better known as a public benefactor, devoting millions to science, education, and philanthropy. Oil was the foundation of the vast wealth which Rockefeller used to help others. Here is an intimate glimpse of the oil magnate posing for Pathé News. And after his picture was taken, he turned cameraman himself, enjoying every minute of it. Deeply interested in his fellow men, Rockefeller was particularly fond of little children, and in recent years became famous for giving them dimes on every occasion. Rockefeller had the real Christmas spirit of giving, and loved to present gifts to his many friends, and to the children he always was delighted to have around him. Riverside Church, with its world-famous Laura Spelman Rockefeller Carillon, is an imposing monument to his faith, and Rockefeller Center, the greatest development of modern times, stands as a tribute to the man who devoted his fortune to the progress of humanity.
Ivy Lee went to work for the IG Farben company, a big German industrial company, and we know now that IG Farben was actually part of the Nazi propaganda inner circle. One of the most effective and, of course, horrifying government propaganda campaigns ever organized was the Nazi campaign that continued for years and years under the direction of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. And IG Farben paid Ivy Lee and also paid Ivy Lee's son to represent not just their interests, but the interests of Nazi Germany in an effort to paint the Nazi regime as being a friendly regime.
But before lending his expertise to the Third Reich, Mr. Lee would do so for the American government. Along with other experts in the burgeoning field of mind science and public relations, he would engineer propaganda for World War I, not just against the enemy, the Germans, but against the American people themselves.
Being careful about my body doesn't just mean major things like regular breast exams. I'm even careful about pain relievers.
I'm Bill Moyers. Do you ever have the feeling that someone you don't know is trying to send you a message? Well, you don't have to believe in extraterrestrial creatures to know it's so. We're all constantly the targets of people who want to win us over. Every government department, every major corporation, every organization with a mission employs experts in public relations whose job is to get their message across in the best possible light. Public relations has become a major industry of the 20th century, product and symbol in a way of our age.
In keeping with Chevron's tradition of service throughout the 20th century, the people of Chevron bring you this program in support of public television.
Before Ivy Lee died in 1934, he had lunch with the only man considered his equal, Edward L. Bernays. There they sat, founding fathers of the business. But Lee was in a pessimistic mood that day, and he told Bernays that public relations was a temporary phenomenon that would probably die with both of them. Bernays was to make sure that didn't happen. He was the first person to say, "I'm a public relations counselor," and he was determined to turn the practice into a recognized profession. He wrote books of theory to make public relations a companion of the new social sciences with special insights into human motivation. But mostly what he did was to make public relations work, and to work well for his clients. What clients they were: RCA, General Motors, the American Tobacco Company, Time Magazine, the Bank of America, the United Fruit Company, the government of India, the city of Vienna, and on and on. Edward Bernays became successful and wealthy, and far from dying out with its founders, public relations flourished. As the First World War ended, he went to Paris to work as a press attaché for the American government. Bernays was present for the arrival there of Woodrow Wilson, an event which was to profoundly influence his life and to change his career. This image of Woodrow Wilson as the living Prince of Peace owed a lot to official U.S. propaganda. Bernays had been part of a federal wartime agency called the Committee on Public Information. Its purpose was to shape public opinion in support of Wilson's war policies at home and abroad. And now, Wilson's crusade to turn the victory into lasting peace. Bernays saw firsthand the power of words and pictures to sway masses of people. Information of a very special sort. As these World War I posters indicate, this was information backed with the powerful force of emotion. The job of the Committee on Public Information was to change the mass of Americans from an isolationist democracy to an organized war machine, molding a confused and shapeless public opinion to a single purpose. In 1917, the committee was to turn to a new and untried medium to reach this public: motion picture film. Movie screens across the nation reflected the coming images of war and the U.S. government's first shaky attempts to propagandize its own people.
Today would be thought of as amateurish vis-a-vis modern social science knowledge. But the committee accomplished a great deal.
So the propaganda was effective, along with other considerations of
I think the propaganda was very effective, and as I say now, It was propaganda and not impropaganda.
Your safe traps logged with grease.
You know, war, as Randolph Bourne said, is the health of the state. And what you saw in World War I was the rise of the military corporate machine, which made war against these radicals through the Sedition Act, the Espionage Act, and more importantly, the Committee for Public Information, or the Creel Commission, which created the system of modern mass propaganda, employing the understanding of crowd psychology pioneered by figures like Le Bon, Trotter, and Sigmund Freud, that people were not moved by fact or reason. They were moved by the very skillful manipulation of emotion. And it worked. So you had Hollywood was making films like Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin. The Creel Commission had its own news division. You couldn't even write anti-war editorials. It was against the law. It had speakers bureaus, and you only had to use the Sedition Act and espionage on those kind of few figures who held fast to an anti-war stance, of which there were not many. And then after the war, the dreaded Hun becomes the dreaded Red, and we enter what Dwight McDonald calls this psychosis of permanent war in the name of anti-communism. You know, war, the fusion of war and the war profiteers, the militarists and the war profiteers, which after World War II created a situation of total war. I mean, after World War I, factories reconverted to produce domestic products. After World War II, they kept producing weapons, even though we had peace. That fusion of the militarists and the corporatists hijacked the country, disemboweled the country economically, and made war on all of those advances that had come under the New Deal. So it had both an economic impact and a political impact. America expanded its power, certainly through the military force and the threat of military force, but more by cultivating indigenous elites that would do our bidding. So you saw the rise of all sorts of dictatorships, you know, whether it was Mobutu in the Congo, or whether Somoza in Nicaragua, or the Shah in Iran, and of course we overthrew the Shah's father and then carried out a coup d'etat to replace Mossadegh, the prime minister who was going to nationalize British oil. You know, that form of colonial power protected Western interests. That's why Allende was overthrown in 1973 and Pinochet was put in power to protect the copper industry from being nationalized. And these elites were given tremendous resources. I mean, you saw the same thing in 1954 in Guatemala with Arbenz, who wanted to challenge United Fruit's huge acquisition of Guatemalan land to give landless peasants, you know, an ability to, you know, carry out subsistence farming. And when that happened, the CIA raised a kind of black army, a huge propaganda effort run by Edward Bernays, the father of modern public relations, who had come out of the Creel Commission. And of course, you know, Arbenz becomes a communist in the eyes of the press, which they, you know, through the manipulation of the press, they are able to justify this. When you're up close, as I was for 20 years, and you see the inner workings of empire, you understand how vicious and ruthless and brutal it is. But it's, you know, very hard to penetrate within the heart of empire that reality, so that reporters such as myself who would report on these things were under constant attack, not only from the State Department and from the government, but from, and I was working for the Dallas Morning News in Central America and later for the New York Times, but from our own Washington bureaus that were being spun a fictitious narrative, and we were kind of demonized as, being the fifth front of the rebel movement. And of course, 22 reporters were killed in El Salvador, some of them assassinated by the death squads. It was, the pressure that Empire will put on those few reporters who attempt to go out and actually report is fierce and can even involve, the loss of life. I can't understand the inability of the traditional press to grasp that we are now in the last moments of an effort to, in essence, effectively extinguish press freedom. But unfortunately, they have divided us against ourselves, and this is, what we've undergone, as John Ralston says, and as I've said many times, a kind of corporate coup d'etat. What we are seeing is a system put into place where it's all propaganda. And anybody who challenges, look, this constant reference to a shield law is absurd, because they just violated the shield law by not going to court and informing AP of a subpoena, but doing it secretly. So, you got to hand it to the Obama administration. They're far more clever than their predecessors in the Bush administration. But they're carrying out exactly the same policy of snuffing out our most basic civil liberties and our most important press freedoms. And that's because they know what's coming, and they are going to legally put in a place by which any challenge to the centers of corporate power become ineffectual or impossible.
In any disaster, your livestock needs protection too. In case of nuclear attack, radiation is as dangerous to animals as it is to people.
I think its success will be measured by whether it encourages people to ask, what does it mean when you have concentrated private power producing a product, namely audiences, for a market which consists of concentrated private power with tight links to state power? What do you expect the media output to look like with that framework, a structural framework behind it? The phrase manufacturing consent was not ours. We borrowed it from the leading public intellectual of the 20th century, Walter Lippmann. He said that's a new art in democracy, to manufacture consent so that the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, his phrase, the population, will be passive and acquiescent and will accept the rule of the responsible men, people like us. And in fact, the myth is that the media are independent, adversarial, courageous, struggling against power, and it's actually true of some, the very fine, often very fine reporters, correspondents. In fact, the media does an honest, courageous job, but within a framework that determines what to discuss, what not to discuss. And what we try to demonstrate in the book is that if you simply look at the institutional structure of the media within a state capitalist society like ours, they're performing it pretty much the way you'd expect.
But when people are kind of, some of the most effective kinds of propaganda are the kinds that allow you to see what's going on. So you see 99%, 1%, but to feel, I can't do anything about it. I'm isolated, alone. I don't talk to anybody. People like me can't do anything. We just have to suffer and bear it. That's really effective propaganda. That's the way, that's how slavery could last forever without many slave rebellions. It's how women were oppressed. So I take, say, my grandmother's generation. If my grandmother had been asked if she's oppressed, she wouldn't have even known what you're talking about. That's life. Women are doormats. That's life. you get to my mother's generation, still plenty of oppression, but and she was bitter about it, but she didn't think you could do anything about it. By the time you get to today, it's quite different. It's very much like the peasants in Brazil, or the indigenous people in Bolivia, or you know, the blacks in the South after the early days of the civil rights movement. Yeah, we can do something about it, even if it's brutal and harsh, and we might get killed. We can do something. You know, it's called apathy, but I suspect it's more hopelessness, powerlessness. And people can learn you're not powerless. Just take a look at what's been done. Take a look at what other people have done under much harsher conditions than you'll ever face. It's a very thin structure of power. I mean, as soon as you submit it to ridicule or you dismiss it, it can collapse. And this has been understood for centuries. So you go back to, say, David Hume. He says power is always in the hands of the governed, those who are being ruled. Power is always in their hands. So how come they just don't overthrow the rulers and take things for themselves? He says, well, the secret, he says, always, every society is control of opinion and attitudes. If you can convince people, if the powerful can convince people, you have to stay in your slot. That's where you belong. And that's your role in life. There's nothing to be changed. Then the rulers can control them.
I think we're probably the most media-dominated society in the world. Half a dozen corporations own and control most of the mainstream media in our country. So if you're looking at who rules America or who owns America, it's the same people that propagandize to America. When you look at who's on the boards of media corporations, they're also on the boards of U.S. oil companies, and they're on the boards of U.S. military contractors. So trying to study who owns America, you're really also, these are the people that own the media. We don't have a state media, but in some ways it's very much like a state media. It's the corporate state. The corporations that own the U.S. media and own U.S. television are very wealthy and very powerful. And the people at the top of the news networks get paid an awful lot of money. I have never earned anything close to the amount of money I earned in the 1 year I worked where General Electric was my boss at MSNBC. So what I think happens is a self-censorship where the people who rise to the top have learned how not to rock any boats, and they know if they do rock boats, they will lose their huge salaries.
It's unequivocal, and I kind of stumbled into this, is that the media companies, the major media companies, i.e. the Disneys, the CBSs, the news corporations, all of them, this is all public documents, is that they're all actually owned by mutual fund companies. The majority shareholders are owned by mutual fund companies. So, and also, they also get a lot of their revenue from these companies. So you're never going to see any consistent criticism about these fund companies.
Are these companies investigated by the media?
No, they're not.
Are they responsible to the public in some way? Are they accountable? Do the public really know what they're doing?
The public really doesn't have a clue.
You know, there are a couple of things going on there. Obviously, you've got kind of cable channels that are, you know, in different camps, and they are not showing different points of view. You've got Fox News showing the right, you've got MSNBC showing the left. And so with a setup like that, you have Americans that are just kind of tuning in to the channel they want to listen to, that, you know, kind of expresses their views, and you're not seeing kind of a mix of an opinion, a debate, anything like that.
The media focuses on personalities, you know, and often the quirks of personality, Clinton's sexual escapades, or whether Obama was born in the United States or not, or Romney and his cars and whatever, you know, his not paying taxes and many other things. Those are not totally unimportant issues, but maybe it's the nature of the media today in and of itself, in that it has to go for the quick news. Deep investigative reporting is not emphasized as much as perhaps it was in the past. And, you know, you got to sell papers, and scandal sells papers, personality sells papers, celebrity sells papers. So you're right, that the larger nature of how the system operates tends not to get emphasized as much.
Because the political theater, I mean, the personal narrative of the candidate, it's all irrelevant. It's meaningless, and people, we still play the game. Look, every totalitarian country I covered had elections. They all play the charade. I mean, even East Germany did, and that's the charade we play. And when we have a compliant corporate media that pretends that charade is real. So I think the problem is that the illusion still remains so powerful. But people are changing, but the illusion is still so powerful that people confuse where power actually exists.
I was in the Soviet Union, and we were always raised in this country that that's pure propaganda. And frankly, it was very ineffective propaganda because they never pretended to have two points of view. They would have one point of view saying how great things are. But in our country, propaganda is really effective because they have the appearance of debates.
You would think there would be some independence in the journalism on this issue. But in some cases, reporters have even said to me, well, I can't go after the Pentagon harder or the companies harder or this nexus of influence harder because this company is a big advertiser in the paper and we'll get pressure if we do those kinds of stories. So we'll do stories about the war in Afghanistan, we'll repeat what the president has to say on an issue, but there's not really a lot of interest or resources put into investigating these kinds of connections.
For General Electric, here is Ronald Reagan. Good evening.
I don't want to blame this all on the media. Of course, it's not. We're talking in the first instance about federal agencies and what laws might have been broken. But the fact of the matter is the media has a long and distinguished track record here of suppression, and that's why we're here today. So I would just answer it that simply. The scandal involves the media, so the media is not interested in investigating themselves.
You can go to the Kerry Committee report, 1,166 pages. You can go to the National Security Archives, where all the North Notebook entries that Joe mentioned are cited. You can go back to the original 1985 AP report, and we've got the numbers of the two reporters, Robert Parry and Brian Barger, right here. This isn't our allegations. This is the allegations on the CIA's own records and on this country's congressional committee documents.
We're here because we are tired of the suppression. The techniques of suppression are old. If this is an old story, then the techniques of suppression are old. Call the skeptics names like conspiracy theorists, nuts, ranters, kooks, crackpots, and of course rumor mongers. Impugn the motives of those of us who are critics and therefore and suggest strongly that we have a political agenda.
For 10 years, the New York Times, as well as other national media, have been covering up or bottling up the story linking the Nicaraguan Contras to cocaine. They've suppressed stories, they've botched stories.
Separate the press and state.
2, 4, 6, 8.
Separate the press and state.
The CIA has got to go.
Wednesday on 8 is Enough.
We got the buggy fever.
The Bradford girls go disco crazy.
Hey, hiya, hun. What do you say we get down?
And the summer's off to a red-hot start.
This is what was once known as a dunce's cap, remember?
Operation Mockingbird was a secret campaign by the United States Central Intelligence Agency to influence media. Began in the 1950s, it was initially organized by Cord Meyer and Alan W. Dulles, and was later led by Frank Wisner, after Dulles became the head of the CIA.
We just fought a war, and in a war you conduct all sorts of operations, deception operations, behind-the-lines activity, sabotage, all the rest of it. And I was involved in that, and the OSS was involved in that. The CIA was set up first to collect intelligence, and to analyze intelligence, to centralize intelligence, to get it all together so it could be all looked at together in the best academic tradition. Also, however, it was set up in order to struggle at that subversive level with the subversive forces that we faced.
The CIA from the very beginning, at least as early as 1951, has used the information that it has collected, and it has used the information in order to penetrate and to manipulate the institutions of power in whatever country it is operating in order to influence the course of events in those countries. And essentially this boils down to propping up those forces which are considered to be the friendly forces, and in penetrating, dividing, weakening, and ultimately destroying those forces which are considered to be the enemy forces.
The organization recruited leading American journalists into the network to help present the CIA's views, and funded some student and cultural organizations and magazines as fronts to create an organization that concentrated on propaganda and economic warfare. Wisner, recruited by Philip Graham from the Washington Post to run the project within the industry, the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS, and other communications vehicles. After 1953, the network was overseen by CIA Director Allen Dulles, by which time Operation Mockingbird had major influence over 25 newspapers and wire agencies. The usual methodology was placing reports developed from intelligence provided by CIA to witting or unwitting reporters. Those reports would then be repeated or cited by the preceding reporters, which in turn would be then cited throughout the media wire services. These networks were run by people with well-known liberal but pro-American big business connections. The Office of Policy Coordination was funded by siphoning off funds intended for the Marshall Plan. Some of this money was used to bribe journalists and publishers. Frank Wisner was constantly looking for ways to help convince the public of the dangers of Soviet communism. In 1954, Wisner arranged for the funding of a Hollywood production of Animal Farm, an animated allegory based on the book written by George Orwell. In the 1950s, some 3,000 salaried and contract CIA employees were eventually engaged in propaganda efforts. Wisner was able to constrain newspapers from reporting about certain events, including CIA plots to overthrow governments of Iran and Guatemala. Thomas Braden, head of the International Organizations Division, played an important role in Operation Mockingbird. Many years later, he revealed his role in these events. There was simply no limit to the money. It could spend unlimited amounts on the people it would hire, and there was no limit to their activities. In 1952, the Office of Policy Coordination, which dealt with cover actions such as paramilitary or psychological influence operations, and the Office of Special Operations, which dealt with espionage and counter-espionage, were merged under the Deputy Director Allen W. Dulles. When Dulles became the head of the CIA in 1953, Frank Wisner became the head of this new organization, and Richard Helms became his chief of operations. Mockingbird became the responsibility of the VDP. J. Edgar Hoover became jealous of the CIA's growing power. Institutionally, the organizations were very different, with the CIA holding a more politically diverse group, in contrast to the more conservative FBI. This was reflected in Hoover's description of the OPC as Wisner's gang of weirdos. Hoover began having investigations done into Wisner's people. He found that some of them had been active in left-wing politics in the 1930s. This information was passed to Senator Joseph McCarthy, who started making attacks on members of the OPC.
I joined CIA in September 1951. The preceding year, April 1950, NSC 68 was drawn up. It was a joint interagency working paper. It was inspired primarily by Dean Acheson, and it was the blueprint for the Cold War.
It is not only the threat of direct military attack which must be considered, but also that of conquest by default, by pressure, by persuasion, by subversion, by neutralism, by all the paraphernalia of indirect aggression which the communist movement has used.
It was the height of the Cold War. Senator McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, was terrorizing the nation with charges of a great internal communist conspiracy. The State Department, according to him, you will remember, those of you who are old enough, was filled with Soviet spies. Concept was that the Soviet Union was engaged in a worldwide effort to obtain domination everywhere.
The institutions of power which are penetrated and attempts are made to manipulate them are the political parties, the security services, the military institutions, the trade union organizations especially, the youth and student movements, cultural organizations, professional societies, and in a very big way, the public information media.
Hoover also gave McCarthy details of an affair that Frank Wisner had with Princess Karaja in Romania during the war. McCarthy, as part of his campaign against government, began accusing other senior members of the CIA as being security risks. McCarthy claimed that the CIA was a sinkhole of communists and said he would root out 100 of them. One of his first targets was called Mayer, who was still working for Operation Mockingbird. In August of 1953, Richard Helms, Wisner's deputy at OPC, told Mayer that McCarthy had accused him of being a communist. The Federal Bureau of Investigation said it was unwilling to give Mayer security clearance without referring to any evidence against him. Alan W. Dulles and Frank Wisner both came to his defense and refused to permit an FBI interrogation of Mayer. The CIA was directed to unleash Mockingbird on McCarthy. Drew Pearson, Joe Alsop, Jack Anderson, Walter Lippmann, and Ed Morrow all engaged in intensively negative coverage of McCarthy. His political reputation was permanently damaged by the press coverage orchestrated by Wisner. Mockingbird was very active during the overthrow of President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman and in Guatemala during Operation Success. Dulles restrained certain journalists from traveling to Guatemala. As the CIA's wealth and power increased, its aggressive focus toward the Soviet Union soon began not only heating up the Cold War, but also disrupting relations with America's European allies. They considered rising Third World liberationist movements as potential threats to their political systems. Consequently, even in the wake of Secretary of State John Foster Dulles pledging during the 1952 presidential campaign to roll back the Iron Curtain, American covert action operations came under scrutiny almost as soon as Dwight Eisenhower was inaugurated in 1953. He soon set up an evaluation operation called Solarium, which had 3 committees playing analytical games to see which plans of action should be continued. In 1955, President Eisenhower established the 5-4-1-2 Committee in order to keep more of a check on the CIA's cover activities.
One of the principal mechanisms which the CIA used after World War II in its programs to influence the course of events in different countries was the use of front organizations. For example, in the youth field, the CIA set up the World Assembly of Youth, which continues today with its headquarters in Brussels. In the student field, the CIA set up the Coordinating Secretariat of National Unions of Students.
The operation runs in a very simple way. Most people will join an outfit because their friends belong or because they, well, I guess it's a good idea that I belong to it. But only a few people ever bother to go to the meetings, and these people, of course, always end up as executive officers. Of course, executive officers control all these organizations, and this was the technique that was used by Cordmeyer and his division in youth organizations and in women's organizations and other such groups.
In the trade union field, the CIA founded, or helped to found, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions with its headquarters in Brussels, which continues to exist today.
The committee included CIA Director, the National Security Advisor, and the Deputy Secretaries of State and Defense. They were to determine whether cover actions were proper and in the national interest. Because of plausible deniability, CIA planned cover actions were not referred to the 5412 Committee for review. Ultimately, Eisenhower became concerned that CIA cover activities were being poorly coordinated with American foreign policy. He thought they might have expressed senior corporate interest of upper-class families of the Northeastern establishment. In 1956, he appointed David K.E. Bruce as member of the President's Board of Consultants on Foreign Intelligence Activities. Eisenhower asked Bruce to write in a report on the CIA. It was presented to Eisenhower on December 20th, 1956. Bruce argued that the CIA's cover actions were responsible in great measure for stirring up the turmoil and raising doubts about us that exists in many countries in the world today.
In Washington, D.C., I worked on the Central America desk of Mexico and Central American countries. That was back in 1957, 58. And at that time, well, at first I saw it just as information gathering, and then I realized they were really intervening in the affairs of these countries.
In this Guatemalan town of Equipulas, just occupied by anti-government forces, are the first evidences of that much-publicized anti-communist revolution. This is headquarters for the once exiled officers leading the liberation forces. Colonel Miguel Mendoza is district commander under overall rebel chief Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas.
Elsie would come home and say things like, well, they're buying votes in Guatemala, or words to that effect, you know, and I'd say, well, Elsie, you must have got something garbled, you know. The United States government would never do a thing like that. And I couldn't believe this. In the 9 years, I think I said 1,000 times, the United States government would never do a thing like that. And then I would find out that, in fact, they had done exactly that.
Serious trouble in Tehran, capital of oil-rich Iran. Its pro-Western ruler, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, has lost his throne, temporarily at least. When his army failed to oust the dictatorial-minded Premier Mossadegh, the Shah himself was forced to flee for his life to neighboring Baghdad. Another king without a country. Where he had fled, 33-year-old Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi hears astounding news. Royalist forces have revolted, arrested Dr. Mossadegh, and want their sovereign home. Army men are given principal credit for the sensational change. When the army turned against its Mossadegh-appointed officers, it assured the return of the king.
In 1953, a few CIA people managed to make some changes in Iran that President Eisenhower liked very much. In 1954, a few of us in Guatemala made some changes that seemed almost without effort. However, the demands kept growing. Intelligence was asked to do what armies should have been done. It seemed so easy to hope that secret shenanigans could accomplish what an army should have been doing.
Bruce, also highly critical of Mockingbird, he argued, what right have we to go barging around in other countries, buying newspapers and handing money to opposition parties, or supporting a candidate for this or that, or any other office? In 1962, Tracy Barnes took over the running of Mockingbird. Barnes planted editorials about political candidates who were regarded as pro-CIA in 1964. Random House published Invisible Government by David Wise and Thomas Ross. The book exposed the role of the CIA in foreign policy. This included CIA goons in Guatemala, Iran, and Cuba in the Bay of Pigs invasion. It also revealed CIA's attempts to overthrow President Sukarno in Indonesia and the cover operations taking place in layoffs in Vietnam.
We were supporting every half-assed
dictator, military junta, oligarchy that existed in the Third World, as long as they promised to somehow maintain the status quo, which would, of course, be beneficial to U.S. Geopolitical interests, military interests, big business interests, and other special interests.
In front of the presidential palace in Havana, and it seems as far as the eye can see, Cubans, upwards of 1 million, 5/6 the population of this capital city, nearly 1 out of every 6 persons on the island. Why are they here? Fidel Castro asked them.
Los que creyeron que después de nuestras victorias militares nos iban a aplastar en el campo de la información.
A graduate lawyer, Dr. Castro displays an eloquence and personal dynamism that completely sways the enormous throng.
I felt that we were grossly mishandling the national liberation movement and the emergence of national liberation leaders like Sukarno, Nasser, and Nkrumah, and so forth throughout the world. I did not believe that we should be trying to overthrow these people or assassinate these people, but instead that we should have worked with them.
The ailing premier of Cuba, Fidel Castro, emerges from his convalescence to address a youth congress and to announce that Cuba is expropriating United States-owned property in that country.
The name is chiseled from the telephone building and signs torn down from this and other properties worth nearly $1 billion. At the White House, Presidential News Secretary Haggerty announces a break in diplomatic relations with Cuba.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached.
I am to this day absolutely convinced that we drove Fidel Castro into the arms of the Russian bear because he was frightened that we were going to murder him and destroy his new Cuba, and he was absolutely right.
A French cargo ship, La Coubre, which had just docked with 76 tons of arms and ammunition for the Revolutionary Army, blew up as hundreds of workers unloaded the cargo. 70 are dead and over 300 wounded. Government sources have indicated that there is every reason to suspect sabotage.
The way it would start is maybe an ambassador, maybe a CIA officer, maybe somebody here in Washington, maybe somebody in the White House would suggest that it would be a good idea to help a certain group in another country. That would be looked at to see if we have the contacts, who reliable people we could deal with, and a plan would be put together as to how this would be done. That plan would then be approved within CIA as sensible. It would then be submitted to an interagency group and then submitted to the President for final okay. If the President's approval, then the agency would go ahead.
46 were wounded, 2 killed under questionable circumstances. Castro, in a broadcast speech lasting most of the night, says bombs from U.S.-based planes are responsible for the casualties. Other reports say it was men in cars. Whatever his reasons, Castro stirs strong feelings of anger against the United States.
One of the operations they had was to burn the cane fields. As I understand the way it was done, they had people in frogmen suits. They would take them out to the coast of Cuba, jump into the water with incendiary devices in their frogman outfits, come up on the beach, plant these incendiary devices in the cane fields, and swim back to the boat. They'd take off, and 10, 15 minutes later, the incendiary device would go off, and it'd start a big fire in the cane field.
Fidel señala que al sur de la provincia de Pinar del Río.
Fidel indicates that in the south, in Pinar del Rio province, our radar detected a large ship launching smaller craft. The CIA is in direct control of these operations. It is the CIA which has been organizing the attacks, the infiltration of saboteurs, arms, and explosives. The CIA has been doing all this through people it has directly recruited.
Has a decision been reached on how far this country would be willing to go in helping an anti-Castro uprising or invasion in Cuba?
Well, first I want to say that there will not be under any conditions be an intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces. And this government will do everything it possibly can, and I think it can meet its responsibilities to make sure that there are no Americans involved in any actions inside Cuba.
There's no question that American presidents have found it convenient to make an operation secret, because that way it obviates the necessity for public debate. In many cases, it's obviated the necessity for any sort of discussion in the Congress. Indeed, that's what led to the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs. Gee, we have another big one to do, and we'll keep it secret too, when it couldn't be kept secret.
Cuban revolutionary troops such as these have invaded Castro's leftist island fortress, reportedly rallied by a mysterious coded radio message. Alert, alert, look well at the rainbow. The fish will be running very soon. From the sea and by parachute, the rebels have struck along the coast within 90 miles of Havana. Initial accounts of the fighting sketchy, but strafing and bombing of communications and military targets reported with heavy casualties. Meanwhile, in Havana, acting Foreign Minister Olivares shows foreign envoys and newsmen scorched fragments of what may have been rockets fired during the B-26 raids. As might be expected, he points an accusing finger at the U.S. The same line is followed at a dramatic meeting of the United Nations General Assembly's Political Committee by Cuban Foreign Minister Raul Roa, charging his nation has been invaded by what he terms mercenaries from Guatemala and Florida. Quickly, forcefully, the charges are denied by Chief U.S. Delegate Adlai E. Stevenson.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically. The United States has committed no aggression against Cuba, and no offensive has been launched from Florida or from any other part of the United States.
I had been stationed in Cuba on two occasions, in 1955 and 1956. Then I returned in 1959, 58. I was there 59 and 60 before I had to leave rather abruptly. I had an affinity for Cuba. The Cuban people are marvelous. I'd seen what was going on there. And many of the participants in the Bay of Pigs were on that landing force because I had known them personally in Cuba. And I had recommended on a number of occasions that such and such a person would be a good man to have in the brigade. So when that broadcast came from the beach and the leader said, "We're standing in the water and there's nothing else we can do," and he cursed us. I felt he was cursing me too.
Tragic epilogue to a gallant venture. Outside the Miami headquarters of the Cuban Revolutionary Front, exiled wives and mothers seek word of the men who participated in the ill-starred liberation invasion. For most, no news is bitter news, especially as in Havana, Fidel Castro, in a 4-hour television harangue, shouts death for all 700 captives he claims taken in the abortive landing. Miles away in the serenity of Camp David, President Kennedy and former President Eisenhower confer on the repercussions of the Cuban episode. General Eisenhower promises bipartisan support for the president in this crisis as the president moves to the next round of the unceasing East-West power struggle over Cuba.
I've said as much as I feel can be usefully said by me in regard to the events of the past few days. Further statements, detailed discussions are not to conceal responsibility, because I'm the responsible officer of the government, but merely because and that is quite obvious, but merely because I do not believe that such a discussion would benefit us during the present difficult situation.
The Secretary gave us a crisp, clinical analysis of the death of the Cuban venture. But of course, no post-mortem can revive a corpse.
When the Bay of Pigs failed, I was sitting in the building on that night that everyone knew it was a failure, and Robert Kennedy came in his shirt sleeves, and he had been sent there by his brother to clean that place out. He wanted to find out what had gone wrong and do something about it. The result, however, was that Bobby Kennedy fell in love with the concept of clandestine operations. And we now know there is one question that's not been answered. Did President Kennedy and did Bobby Kennedy know that there were assassination plans against Fidel Castro? It's an unanswered question. The one thing that I'm absolutely sure of is that not only they knew, but they wished for the continuance of that long period after the Bay of Pigs, in which there were many actions taken against Cuba. To put it precisely, there was at one point when Bobby Kennedy said, "When are you fellows going to get off your bottoms and do something about Fidel Castro?"
There were found some a suit, a wetsuit, a clamshell, various things that were on the shelf in the agency that were regarded as things that might be used in possibly killing Castro or being used against him, which never came off the shelf, were never used. If that's a plot to have created this, then I will back up and say that then we ought to enumerate every single item that conceivably had to do with the invasions of Cuba, which we were constantly running. Under the government aegis, we had task forces that were striking at Cuba constantly. We were attempting to blow up power plants. We were attempting to ruin sugar mills. We were attempting to do all kinds of things during this period. This was a matter of American government policy. This wasn't the CIA. If those things taper over into assassination plots, maybe so.
Why didn't you want to tell the Warren Commission, or why didn't you tell the Warren Commission about the efforts to get rid of Fidel Castro or to overthrow the Cuban government?
But Mr. Dodd, you're singling me out as to why I didn't march up and tell the Warren Commission when these operations against Cuba were known to the Attorney General of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, the President of the United States himself, although he at that point was dead. I mean, all kinds of people knew about these operations high up in the government. Now, why am I singled out as the fellow that should have gone up and identified a government operation to get rid of Castro? And it was a government-wide operation supported by the Defense Department, supported by the National Security Council, supported by almost everybody in high position in the government.
As far as I ever knew or know now, no one in the White House or at the cabinet level ever gave any approval of any kind to any CIA effort to assassinate anyone. I told the committee in particular that it is wholly inconsistent with what I know of President Kennedy and his brother Robert that either of them would ever have given any such order or authorization or consent to anyone through any channel.
You were head of the agency during the time when most of these allegations occurred. What did you tell the commission?
Well,
your knowledge of assassination plots?
I had no knowledge of it whatsoever. And as you know, I stated that there was feasibility or lack of feasibility. There obviously were discussions of the question of whether such matters had been planned, but I had to plead ignorance because none were brought to my attention, and therefore I knew nothing of them.
No president in his right mind is going to say, dear director, I hereby order you to assassinate Fidel Castro. In fact, he will probably do the exact opposite. He will issue what is known in the trade as an on-order or a non-directive. He will say, we have these terrible problems down here in Cuba, and it's quite obvious to all of us that the key to it is Fidel Castro. Now, if we could just get rid of that person, maybe we could work out some kind of an arrangement. But of course, we can't do anything like that. That would be wrong.
The CIA considered buying the entire printing of Invisible Government, but this idea was rejected when Random House pointed out that if this happened, they would have to print a second edition. John McCann, the new director of the CIA, tried to prevent Edward Yates from making a documentary on the CIA for the National Broadcasting Company. This attempt at censorship failed, and NBC broadcasted this critical documentary. In June, in 1965, Desmond Fitzgerald was appointed as head of the Directorate for Plans and took charge of Mockingbird. At the end of 1966, Fitzgerald learned that Ramparts had discovered that the CIA had been secretly funding national student associations and was considering publishing an account. When the magazine advised the CIA it had lost control of the information and would likely be forced to publicize, Fitzgerald ordered a plan to either neutralize the campaign or wind down Mockingbird. He appointed Edgar Applewhite to organize a campaign against Ramparts. Applewhite later told Evan Thomas for his book, The Very Best Men, "I had all sorts of dirty tricks to hurt their circulation and financing. The people running Ramparts were vulnerable to blackmail. We had awful things in mind, some of which we carried off." Ramparts published the account in March of 1967. The article, written by Saul Stern, was entitled NSA and the CIA. As well as reporting CIA funding of the National Student Association, Stern exposed the wide system of anti-communist front organizations in Europe, Asia, and South America. It named Cord Meyer as a key figure in this campaign, which included the funding of the literary journal Encounter. Applewhite managed to control some of the account by steering references away from leftist organizations and toward the few conservative organizations backed by the CIA. Further details of Operation Mockingbird were revealed as a result of Senator Frank Church's investigations in 1975. According to the congressional report published in 1976, the CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and, at times, attempted to influence opinion through the use of cover propaganda.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. Now, we're looking at that very carefully.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, certain relationships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
We have quite a lot of detailed information, and we will evaluate it, and we will include any evidence of wrongdoing or any evidence of impropriety in our final report and make recommendations.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI.
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
Senator, do you think that you named the news organizations in your final report?
That remains to be decided.
I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations of the period of the 1970s, it seems to me that a reporter's got to be much more circumspect in doing it now, or he runs the risk of at least being looked at with considerable disfavor by the public. I think you've got to be much more careful about it.
These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of newspapers and periodicals, scores of press services and news agencies, radio and television stations, commercial book publishers, and other foreign media outlets. In February of 1976, George H.W. Bush, the recently appointed director of the CIA, announced a new policy effective immediately. The CIA will not enter into any peddle contract relationship with any full-time or part-time news correspondent accredited by any U.S. news service, newspaper, periodical, radio, or television network station. He added that the CIA would continue to welcome the voluntary and paid cooperation of journalists. According to the Family Jewels report released by the National Security Archive on June 26, 2007. During the period from March 12, 1963 to June 15, 1963, the CIA installed telephone taps onto Washington-based news reporters.
I don't think there is any possibility for reform of the CIA. I gave up my hope of this after seeing the poor performance of the Church Committee, which was infiltrated by CIA people and to some extent sabotaged to some extent, co-opted. I mean, the people that were working on the news media was a CIA guy. There were other CIA people involved. And the CIA officers themselves say, you know, we didn't, Church didn't get anything we didn't give him.
We have government agencies like the Congress, the Senate Committee, for example, to oversee the CIA, talking about the agency now being under control and that the abuses of the past have now been eliminated, as if the agency wasn't under control all along, and as if what they call abuses weren't ordered by presidents. The main argument is not with the agency, which is an instrument for policy execution, but the main argument is with the president and the people outside the CIA who determine the interests which have to be protected and how, who determine American foreign policy, and then call upon the CIA and other agencies to execute that policy.
The Mike Wallace Interview, presented by the American Broadcasting Company in association with the Fund for the Republic, brings you a special television series discussing the problems of survival and freedom in America.
Good evening, I'm Mike Wallace. Tonight's guest, Aldous Huxley, is a man of letters. He's just finished a series of essays called Enemies of Freedom, in which he outlines and defines some of the threats to our freedom in the United States. And Mr. Huxley, right off the bat, let me ask you this. As you see it, who and what are the enemies of freedom here in the United States?
Well, I don't think you can say who in the United States. I don't think there are any sinister persons deliberately trying to rob people of their freedom. And I also think that there are a number of technological devices which anybody who wishes to use can use to accelerate this process of going away from freedom, of imposing control.
Well, what are these forces and these devices, Mr. Huxley?
Well, another force which I think is very strongly operative in this country is the force of what may be called over-organization. as technology becomes more and more complicated, it becomes necessary to have more and more elaborate organizations, more hierarchical organizations. And incidentally, the advance of technology has been accompanied by an advance in the science of organization. It's now possible to make organizations on a larger scale than was ever possible before. And so that you have more and more people living their lives out as subordinates in these hierarchical systems controlled by bureaucracies, either the bureaucracies of big business or the bureaucracies of big government.
Now, the devices that you were talking about, are there specific devices or methods of communication which diminish our freedoms in addition to overpopulation and over-organization?
Well, there are certainly devices which can be used in this way. I mean, let us take, after all, a piece of very recent and very painful history is the propaganda used by Hitler, which was incredibly effective. I mean, what were Hitler's methods? Hitler used terror on the one kind, brute force on the one hand, but he also used a very efficient form of propaganda, which he was using every modern device at that time. He didn't have TV, but he had the radio, which he used to the fullest extent, and was able to impose his will on an immense mass of people. I mean, the Germans were a highly educated people. The point is, it seems to me, that there are methods at present available, methods superior in some respects to Hitler's method, which could be used in a bad situation. I mean, what I feel very strongly is that we mustn't be caught by surprise by our own advancing technology. This has happened again and again in history. Technology has advanced, and this changes social conditions, and suddenly people have found themselves in a situation which they didn't foresee and doing all sorts of things they didn't really want to do.
Well, now, what do you mean? Do you mean that we develop our television, but we don't know how to use it correctly? Is that the point that you're making?
Well, at present, the television, I think, is being used quite harmlessly. It's being used, I think, I would feel it's being used too much to distract everybody all the time. But I mean, imagine, which must be the situation in all communist countries, where the television, where it exists, is always saying the same thing the whole time, is always driving along. It's not creating a wide front of distraction, it's creating a one-pointed drumming in of a single idea all the time. It's obviously an immensely powerful instrument.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Without a fixed link to gold, the U.S. Treasury has been able to borrow and spend as much money as it wanted. When the U.S. government needs money, it takes out a loan with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve prints the currency required for the loan, and in return receives an IOU from the U.S. Treasury. These IOUs are called government bonds. With the money provided from these loans, or bonds, the U.S. government pays its bills and obligations. Meanwhile, the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve work closely together to sell these bonds at auction, where foreign central banks, pension funds, and even individuals buy these U.S. government loans. And why wouldn't they? Loaning money to the U.S. government is virtually a risk-free investment. But if the loans are spent on bills and paying off previous loans, where does the government get the money to pay back the current loan and the interest that is charged on it? Is investing in a U.S. government bond simply one small part in a giant Ponzi scheme? Since 1971, the United States has been running trade deficits with the rest of the world, meaning we've been buying a lot more products from the rest of the world than they have been buying from us. The Japanese and Koreans sell us cars and electronics. The Middle East sells us oil, and the Chinese sell us seemingly everything on our Walmart shelves. The U.S. pays for these products with U.S. dollars, and everyone is happy. But if countries were to convert these U.S. dollar profits back into their own currencies, their currencies would rise in value, making their economies less desirable to trade with. Instead, countries invest their dollar profits by buying U.S. government bonds. So countries around the world sell their goods to the U.S. in exchange for U.S. dollars, which have been borrowed through the Federal Reserve, creating IOUs. And countries then loan their U.S. dollar profits back to the U.S. by buying more IOUs. The money from these loans is spent on paying government expenses, as well as paying back previous IOUs. But in order to do this, larger and larger loans must be made in order to pay back the principal and the interest. By paying back old loans with new and larger loans, it would appear as if the entire world has been investing their hard-earned money into a Ponzi scheme of epic proportions.
In this business of creating money for federal governments and national governments around the world, if they didn't keep creating new money in larger and larger amounts, the whole thing would crash, because that's where the money comes from to pay off the previous loans. It's the new loans. So that's why it's a Ponzi scheme. It's a classic Ponzi scheme.
In order for the U.S. economy to function, we have to borrow more and more money from the rest of the world. And the more money they loan us today, the more money they have to loan us in the future. And if they ever stop loaning, the whole thing collapses and we can't pay them back.
Because today's modern media connects up to the power centers and the ruling class adultery. But you say, well, you know, did they have a Egyptian Sun Times during the pharaohs? Did they have, did they have CBS during, Caligula's time, so they could report on the circus games and the tortures, probably not. And, but the one thing that you think when you think through all of history, and the one thing that's just absolutely clear, is that for the little guy, for the average guy, the organization of society is probably a net negative with the elites that they ended up with. Because it was like, they would kidnap you and you'd have to go to war, your family'd have to go to war, there'd be famines, they'd rob you. Every one of them taxed. Everyone always took from everybody. The ruling elites are constantly making things worse. This is just, you just go through history. And then you say, then you're sort of taught as we get to modern times that we have media that will, fight for the little guy. They actually tell you that. And the media's fighting for the little guy. Well, let's just take one thing. Because there's so many. It's like, you say, like the debt ceiling right now, the latest thing. You'll hear it on the media, they'll be saying, and if they don't raise the debt ceiling, it's going to be a catastrophe, a terrible catastrophe, the worst kind.
On Wednesday, President Obama is going to speak at George Washington University about the deficit, long-term and short-term, raising the nation's debt ceiling, which is the limit on how much money the government can borrow. Now, Congress has never said no to raising the debt ceiling, never. Not raising the debt ceiling would mean defaulting on nearly $10 trillion of government paper already in public hands, being held by investors here and around the world. Now, both sides compare that to Armageddon, the last thing you'd want to play politics over. But tonight, keeping them honest, both sides are either doing just that, playing politics, or having played politics with it in the past, or trying now to explain it away.
Congress has a lengthy to-do list by the end of the month. Failure to act could lead to a government shutdown and to defaulting on our debt obligations for the first time in history.
We have several options for raising the debt ceiling, which is absolutely mandatory. As you mentioned, we've never defaulted on our debt in history. This is really kind of a ridiculous position to be in. We're the only country in the world that has a debt ceiling that works like this. We've raised it close to 100 times over the 104 years it's been in existence. We ought to do away with it.
In Washington, the battle over the U.S. debt ceiling rages on. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell continues his refusal to offer Democrats any help in raising the federal debt limit. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle agree it needs to be raised, and experts warn the failure to do so could result in an economic catastrophe.
Kayla, tell us about what if the country went into a temporary default, what wouldn't get paid? Who wouldn't get paid? Social Security, military families? I can't imagine that any politician would want that to happen.
The majority needs to stop sleepwalking toward yet another preventable crisis. Democrats need to tackle the debt limit.
Again, all of that spoken with a straight face. The Senate expected to vote again this week to suspend the debt ceiling. On Schumer's gamble this way, quote, Democrats are betting that the needed Republican senators will eventually cave in order to stave off an unparalleled economic disaster.
Our allegedly tragic trillion-dollar annual budget deficits, swelling our supposedly unsustainable $16 trillion national debt. More borrowing, it said, means the proverbial road to ruin. Some think then that the fiscal cliff, slashed spending and hiked taxes, is not the horror of horrors, some sort of economic suicide, but the very opposite, the last resort for avoiding a fatal whirlpool of debt.
President Biden blasted Republicans on Monday for opposing an increase or suspension of the nation's debt ceiling. The president warned GOP senators the country could be heading for an economic crisis if the debt limit is not addressed by October 18th.
The Republicans in Congress, what they're doing today is so reckless and dangerous in my view. Raising the debt limit comes down to paying what we already owe, what has already been acquired, not anything new.
Tonight, President Biden warns that economic calamity could strike within 2 weeks if Congress does not raise the debt ceiling, which allows the government to borrow money and pay past debts and meet current obligations.
Bill, 1 second. I just have to interrupt you for a moment here. Actually, President Biden is in the middle of meeting with business leaders about the debt ceiling. I think we can listen in.
And the Raython. And for joining me today to talk about the need to raise the debt limit.
We're back with breaking news on Capitol Hill. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced just minutes ago that a deal has been reached to extend the debt ceiling through December.
Allie, you've had your ear to the ground there on the Hill. Where does the debt ceiling debate stand right now among lawmakers on Capitol Hill?
At a little bit of a standstill.
No Congress in 224 years of American history has allowed our country to default, and it's my sincere hope that this Congress will not be the first.
Well, Dom, thank you. Democrats are now talking about going nuclear on the debt. Now, Treasury is projected to exhaust its extraordinary measures on October 18th. Today, the Bipartisan Policy Center narrowed its window for when the government would actually default to between October 19th and November 2nd.
There is a new offer on the table tonight, a potential pathway out of the impasse between congressional Democrats and Republicans over raising the federal debt limit. The consequences of a default would be severe.
Well, the debt ceiling has not been raised, and it should have been already. Is that this has nothing to do with forthcoming spending. It has nothing to do with Building Back Better, the infrastructure plan, the rescue plan. It has nothing to do with new spending. It has everything to do with the stock of debt that both parties have accumulated.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and others are saying it's time to do away with the debt ceiling.
The debt ceiling played a role at one point in time, but it's certainly been weaponized in a way that is really very destructive for the economy.
Do away with debt ceilings in the future, is that what you're saying?
I think that is a perfectly fine aspiration.
It's going to be the end of the universe as we know it. Of course, that's ridiculous, because It's actually the inverse. Is the increasing of the money printing. It's the worst thing for the little guy. His savings and wages are constantly being demolished, while the elites do all these things and say, "See, look what we're doing for you," but it's really what they're doing to you. And the thing is that the money flows to the elites. All the politicians come rolling in there, and they come leaving. They're just filthy rich. Why? Because that's the whole point of all of it. And the media is there to keep the illusion going. The debt ceiling's a really fun one because they've been doing it for years, decades. It's a funny game. It's like if you went to the Wizard of Oz, the guy behind the curtain pulling the levers, he would be embarrassed by the debt ceiling game because that's how ridiculous it is. Well, what always happens is they start the charade up, and you've got the media sort of training all the citizens to root for something that's really bad for them, and then the two-party, the duopoly, Democrats and Republicans, come out and play their game, and their game is one of which, well, first of all, here's one simple little thing. If you think that, oh, what a tragedy if the debt ceiling isn't raised, well, they make it very large. They have a very large income on taxes into the federal government, and if they didn't print any money, and we would have to go back to the 2014 levels of spending. Well, last I recall, the 2014, levels of spending were quite a bit. And it wasn't a crisis back then. You didn't have people, in the streets crying for crackers. It's 2000. So it's all baloney anyway. The Republicans come out and they go, well, we have to respect the debt. See, they come across as the keepers of the flame. They pretend like they're trying to protect everybody from this money printing. Never mind the fact when they're running the thing, when they have, the presidency and the Congress and the Senate, and they have it all together, they print money like drunken sailors. They no more care than anything. But they understand one thing, is that money printing initially makes it seem like things are getting better, though technically they're just getting worse deep down under the surface. And they would just like the crashes to occur under the Democrats. Yeah, for their credit, the Democrats, they're crazy. They like printing money no matter who's in power. They can never get enough of it, And so the Republicans, and the Democrats square off. And the net point of this battle is to con everyone to start rooting, please raise the debt ceiling, please. Then at the end, just like every time before it, miraculously, as the deadline looms, we have come to a deal. We shall raise the debt ceiling. We've come to the deal. It's so hilarious. It's so ridiculous. It's like staged. It's theater. It's absolutely ridiculous. And so, and they tell the same story over and over. You would think that if you were lying all the time, that you would change some dimension of it to sort of hide it, Change the name, say this can't be done because of that. Just invent something, but to tell this funny story over and over and over, it's hilarious. And to, peak, to really hit a peak about this, of how absurd it is. Of course, you've got the great comedians. Those guys they're always telling you, they're serious people, the comedians. They're there to really let you know how things work. These big primetime comedians, Yeah, I like, I like when they're funny, but more and more they're funny in that they're just sort of echo chambers is their main comedy now. But they're the most ridiculous when they tell this tale of woe. Well, now they're coming up, this is how ridiculous it's coming. Is they're saying, well, how are we going to do about the debt, and we got to deal with the debt ceiling. Well, how about if we come up with a $1 trillion platinum coin?
Moving on. Our main story tonight concerns the national debt, the world's most boring $28 trillion. And I know just saying 28 trillion might sound confusing. How much is that exactly? Well, to put it one way, it's $28 trillion. To put it another way, it's 28 million millions. To put it a third way, it's an absolute ton of money. But regardless, the national debt is a complete obsession in this country. Our national debt is undeniably big, and between the trillions in coronavirus stimulus bills and the infrastructure plans Biden unveiled just this week, it's poised to get even bigger.
And tonight, I come to you on an historic day in America, potentially, maybe. Because the big story today is all the stuff that might possibly happen soon, or not. Take the debt ceiling. If Congress doesn't raise our country's borrowing limit by October 18th, the entire American economy will have a cataclysmic meltdown. It would be an easily avoidable, unthinkable act of self-destruction. So, highly likely. Another even more hypothetical solution to America's debt crisis, a $1 trillion coin could be minted at the last minute. Now, I'm no U.S. Treasury expert, but please do it. Make the coin. Here's how Operation Megacoin would work. The president could order the Treasury Secretary to mint a $1 trillion coin, then deposit it with the Federal Reserve. Then, just like that, the government would have an additional $1 trillion to pay off its obligation. This isn't just any $1 trillion coin. Oh no, for starters, it has to be made out of platinum because the Treasury has limits on paper, gold, silver, and copper currency, but there is no limit on how many platinum coins it can circulate or on their value.
Yeah, a $1 trillion platinum coin. See, we'll put that 1 ounce of platinum in the Federal Reserve's coffers, and that'll retire all that debt, It's like, and when they need to, then the Fed can always sell the $1 trillion coin to someone. Someone will buy an ounce of platinum for $1 trillion, right? That's what's inferred. And these guys also say stuff like, the most ridiculous thing of all the things they say is they say something like, raising the debt ceiling shows that America is willing to pay its debts. It's willing to, it's not a deadbeat. It's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite of that. It's ridiculous. If America was not going to default on its debt, it wouldn't raise the debt ceiling. And it would make government spending, stay within its means. And they would pay down the debt. They would really do that. But they're not going to. They're going to default on the debt. And that's what raising the debt ceiling is defaulting on the debt. What does that mean? And the thing is okay, pretend your grandmother takes out a loan for a house. And now the payment comes due, the first payment comes due. And she says, you really need to lend me some more money, because if you don't lend me money, I won't be able to make the payment on the house. And he goes, so lend me the money so I can show you that I'm not a deadbeat and I'm good for my debt. That's what the government does. This is what the media rubber stamps. And now it comes to $1 trillion coin. Well, why don't they take it to its logical conclusion? Don't have a $1 trillion coin. Instead, why don't you have a $1 trillion turd, a $5 trillion turd? No, a $30 trillion turd, so that we can square everything up. And it'll be a big red and blue turd, and they can shine it up, and they can put it in the Federal Reserve's coffers, and you can just go, see, we're making good on our debt. the $30 trillion turd. And then we could go look to media and then have the media explain, this turd represents the culmination of greatness that America aspires to. Only in a country like America can a turd be worth $30 trillion. And then the comedians can start repeating it word for word, and we'll have the complete circle, you know? I love media. They're hilarious.
So they're going to go all the way until they totally destroy the value of the dollar, where people will have to do something like rushing out of the dollar and into goods and services. I do believe that will happen.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities, Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about troubling and irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country. Plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely
dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely
dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous
to our democracy. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Now, I do take on the demagogues in the United States.
Esta Moeto.
I'm an analyst, all right? And when I say something, I back it up.
Heart is black, great abyss. Dumb solutions drop like rain. Acid rain. He runs before him, but before him must run him. One day as an idea might hit his brain. The target is small, the mouth is big. When the idea gets there, it will be a O'Reilly says words without thought, noise without end. The parody. Hear what the nut O'Reilly says. The end of evolution in a bag of wind.
Today on the O'Reilly Report, Mr. O'Reilly will speak on issues of substance of the day.
One defense, turn down the volume knob, and all there is to make you sick will be his face. Great accomplishment that he has achieved. With only half a brain he runs a TV show. Ratings are tall, mouth is big. When the show starts, it will be a nut O'Reilly says. He babbles like a peanut in heat. Parody. A parody.
what the nut O'Reilly says. If you break wind, it will make more sense.
Yeah.
That's tomorrow, and that is it for us today. Okay, I don't know. Whatever it is, it's not right on the teleprompter. I don't know what that is. I've never seen that.
No, there is. We are going to do Sting, yeah.
Okay, but now I can't read it. There's no words on it.
Okay. Ready? Sure.
There's no words there. To play us out. What does that mean? To play us out.
Sting is going to do. It's a video. Sting video.
What is
for credits?
I don't know what that means. To play us out. What does that mean? To end the show?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, go.
In 5, 4, 3.
That's tomorrow, and that is it.
Okay. In 5, 4, 3.
That's tomorrow, and that is it for us today. And we will leave you with a. I can't do it.
Okay.
We'll do it live.
Okay.
We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it, and we'll do it live. Fucking thing sucks.
In 5, 4, 3.
That's tomorrow, and that is it for us today. I'm Bill O'Reilly. Thanks again for watching. We'll leave you with Sting and a cut off his new album. Take it away. Now, George Carlin also dealt with a number of controversial issues. The 71-year-old comedian died from heart failure over the weekend. I spoke with him several years ago. When I see a guy like you, and I say, well, why does he need to use the F word when he can punch the line, get the laugh without the F word? Why do you need to use it?
It's not a need. It's a choice.
Well, why do you choose to use it?
Well, because it's a form of spice in my stew.
Fucking thing sucks.
The unwritten credo of the New York Times is do not alienate those for whom we depend for money and access. And that means the power elite and the financiers who advertise.
Direct from our newsroom in New York, in color. This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion.
And that's the way it is. That's the way it is. That's the way it is. And that's the way it is, Monday, September the 2nd, 1963. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
The ruling class is the rich who really command our industry, our commerce, our finance, and those people are able to so manipulate our democracy that they really control the democracy, I feel.
And that's the way it really is.
The film industry signs up in the campaign to help answer communist lies. Mr. Cecil B. DeMille says,
signing the Freedom Scroll today will cost you less than a minute of your time. Let it be your firm commitment to this warfare for the minds of men, that this world under God shall have a new birth of freedom.
Hollywood is both a place and an idea. So you've got the movie studios, you've got television, you've got the music industry. Sometimes, as we know, it's also a place where there's a lot of propaganda.
So whatever policy the U.S. government is committed to, you can be sure that Hollywood will be following it within 12 months.
How would I define Hollywood?
They call it the dream manufacturer, which I think is true. But I think equally it's a propaganda factory.
Why do they follow the policies of the State Department or the Pentagon? Well, they get a lot of money from the State Department and the Pentagon. The State Department and the Pentagon have a lot of say in works of Hollywood.
Meet the Parents with Ben Stiller. Funny movie. Love it, right? So you find out that De Niro was a CIA operative at one point. Ben Stiller goes into his lair in the basement, and he sees photos of De Niro with Clinton, with what looks like maybe a bin Laden type figure. Originally, Stiller found a CIA torture manual on De Niro's desk. The CIA itself reviewed the script and said, nah. You're not going to bring up CIA torture. In any film that has any military hardware in it, an obvious example, Top Gun, you gotta ask for permission. You don't just walk on to the Air Force Base and start flying jets around. So if you get their permission, they get the right to look at what you're saying about them. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. It wasn't created for propaganda purposes, but Hollywood certainly is now a real propaganda force in the world. Probably the greatest propaganda force that's ever existed.
Watch any big-budget war movie or take in a spy thriller, and you could walk away not knowing just how much your movie experience was shaped by the Pentagon or CIA. However, a trove of official documents obtained under U.S. Freedom of Information laws and published this year detail the dealings between filmmakers and intelligence officials at Langley, Virginia, the CIA headquarters.
Probably the best known are Zero Dark 30 and Argo, but they've also assisted the television show Homeland.
How do we deal with homegrown, violent jihadists?
They've also assisted Alias.
You work for the very enemy you thought you were fighting.
24.
Tell me where the device is!
A CBS series called The Agency.
Then he slit his throat.
They assisted a film called The Sum of All Fears, starring Ben Affleck.
Captain Jack Ryan, CIA.
Throughout the 1990s, the CIA worked with Hollywood very specifically on movies that portrayed the CIA as sort of a heroic force protecting America. Most of the movies were based on Tom Clancy books, actually. So you had A Hunt for Red October and that entire franchise. You know, the lead character, Jack Ryan, is this like super heroic figure, and he's like constantly, you know, taking down bad guys and saving America, saving the world from various threats, whether it's Islamic terrorism or the IRA or ultimately white supremacists.
The Department of Defense is actually a much more powerful player in the entertainment industry for basically financial reasons. The Department of Defense has expensive toys. They have submarines, they have aircraft carriers, they have tanks, and they have the personnel to operate each of those things. So if a filmmaker wants to make a war movie, they often will approach the Department of Defense and basically ask to borrow that equipment. And the Department of Defense will say, maybe, but can I see your script? And they will either say, this is great, we love the way that the military is portrayed in this, we will go ahead and collaborate with you. Or they may say, we hate the way that we're portrayed and refuse to participate. What happens in the 1990s is that the Cold War ends. And all of a sudden, the CIA is left without a visible, viable enemy to justify its existence. If they were going to continue, they had to do something to improve their public image. And one of the responses to that crisis was to begin to work with Hollywood to convince the American public that, and Congress, that they were still worth being an institution.
In 1996, the CIA's Entertainment Liaison Office in Hollywood began offering free support to movies that featured the agency. Chase Brandon, an intelligence agent and cousin of actor Tommy Lee Jones, was the CIA's first liaison officer. He's credited as a technical advisor on a host of Hollywood blockbusters, such as The Recruit, starring Al Pacino as a veteran CIA officer. In reality, Brandon was far more than a mere advisor on The Recruit. He helped pitch the film to Disney, that eventually produced and distributed the movie, and was involved in the script writing.
The Recruit.
As another CIA liaison officer put it, Hollywood is the only way the public learns about the agency. Which begs the question, should the public be learning about the CIA from the CIA without even being aware of the agency's role in the production process? These issues became public with the release of one of the biggest CIA Hollywood collaborations to date, Zero Dark 30, a film about the search for Osama bin Laden.
You really believe this story? Osama bin Laden?
The Zero Dark 30 was a really unusual case, I think, for the CIA in terms of how it works with Hollywood. The CIA gave the director and screenwriter a lot of access to the agency. They bounced a lot of ideas back and forth, and they wanted to really kind of tightly control the narrative that this was putting out.
But so we've never made the case or argued the case that somehow Osama bin Laden was directly involved in 9/11. That evidence has never been forthcoming.
It backfired, though, because very quickly after the movie came out, it was criticized for suggesting that torture somehow had played a role in the information gathering that led to the capture and assassination of Osama bin Laden.
Torture and the CIA's use of it, especially after 9/11, were already under investigation when Zero Dark 30 was released. The Senate Intelligence Committee wrote a letter to the production studio, Sony Pictures. They said, "We believe the film is grossly inaccurate and misleading in its suggestion that torture resulted in information that led to the location of Osama bin Laden." Zero Dark 30's director, Catherine Bigelow, eventually had to respond to the allegation that her film was making the CIA's case for torture. In an editorial for the Los Angeles Times, she wrote that critics were, quote, confusing depiction with endorsement. Torture was, as we all know, employed in the early years of the hunt. That doesn't mean it was the key to finding bin Laden. It means it's a part of the story we couldn't ignore.
That's more of a problem with the film industry and the creative industry. Total disinterest in the responsibility of the ideological products that they create. And this is why you can have a very liberal town full of very liberal or even sometimes left-wing celebrities and directors, but actually they create films that are very much in keeping with the American Empire project.
The CIA rarely has any kind of public credit that suggests that they had any hand in shaping the narrative of that film. That lack of transparency I find incredibly problematic because it doesn't allow the viewer to be a smart, critical viewer.
How about this? Why don't they just have at the beginning of each film, made with the support of the Central Intelligence Agency, let's see how long the practice lasts then. Because it won't. Because people will look at it and say, oh, it's one of those propaganda films.
We are going to go over to Chris and talk about the forecast, which is a very good one.
Yeah, actually, conducive to just heading out and enjoying a day. Neighborhood weather at East Brunswick.
Hey, this is Sandy in the back. Can you call ground and see if we can get some more pillows and blankets?
The white zone is for immediate...
The meeting last night was great.
I'm sure he's thrilled.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin boarding. For the load of our first-class passengers, please make their way over to gate 17.
Good morning, sir. You just made it. 4D?
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, looks like we've run into a little bit of rush hour traffic this morning. Unfortunately, it's going to be about a 30-minute delay. I appreciate your patience. We're currently number 1 for departure. Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
I'd like to be home with my babies.
United 93, runway 4 left, clear for takeoff.
Roger that.
Sir, CNN's reporting a light civil aircraft has just hit the World Trade Center.
Man, that's a lot of smoke.
We got another one.
We got another hijack?
United 175 dropped his transponder off.
We got a possible hijack. Weapons. Scramble those fighters in over Manhattan.
Copy that.
We've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, and I'm going to turn the fasten seatbelt sign off. You are safe to move about the cabin.
Descending rapid. This aircraft is going down, I'm telling you right now.
Here's one with juice for you.
No, there he is. There he is right there. He's going right up the Hudson River.
This is a hijack. He's going to hit this guy. Oh! Look,
Look at that.
Oh my gosh.
2 aircraft hit the World Trade Center. Just left Newark, the weather was beautiful.
We have a plane headed toward the Capitol.
What the hell is wrong out there?
May we engage, sir?
I am on a plane that has been hijacked.
Yes, sir. I got F-16s turning and burning towards Washington.
2 planes just hit the World Trade Center.
Nobody's going to help us. We have to do something right now. Colonel, I need rules of engagement. Do we shoot this flight down?
We have to do it now, because we know what happens if we just sit here and do nothing.
You and the president had earlier discussed rules of engagement for taking down a hijacked airplane, but you were the one who gave the direct order to shoot down a plane that you were told, as it turns out incorrectly, was headed for Washington.
Right. That's correct.
What's that moment like?
Well, it was necessary.
In 1947, Jackson Pollock started dripping, flinging, scattering, and pouring paint onto canvases spread across the floor. Some thought it was lunacy, but the most influential voices thought it genius. That's the legacy that has prevailed. That's why you've heard of him and see his work in museums. That's why a single one of his paintings can sell for $50 million. But when you find yourself in front of one of his paintings now, what do you do with it? How do you look at this and derive some sort of something from it? Why does it matter? And what does it mean now?
For centuries, rulers worldwide have forked out fortunes to promote the arts. Rarely have they done so in secret. This program tells a bizarre story. How, during the Cold War, an arm of the US government provided covert funding for a huge variety of cultural activity. Intriguingly, this included work by some of the most resonant names in modernist art. Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko. Even today, much of the arts establishment refuses to address the issue of this covert patronage, or even acknowledge the existence of these hidden hands. For the patron was the Central Intelligence Agency.
In the late 1940s, a left-wing, avant-garde painter like Jackson Pollock would have seemed like a very unlikely candidate to receive support from the CIA. Now, this was a time when many Americans, including President Harry Truman, loathed abstract modern art. Americans appreciated more traditional, realistic approaches to painting, and they were put off by the works of artists like Pablo Picasso. Add to this fact that Jackson Pollock was suspected of communist ties, and the CIA's backing of Pollock seems all the more improbable during the height of the McCarthy era. But after World War II, something unexpected happened. A brood of radical American painters helped make New York City the new center of the art world. Artists like Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning, and Jackson Pollock captured the world's attention with large-scale works of pure color and form. This style of painting was radical and new, and most importantly, it was a wholly American art movement. It was called abstract expressionism, and by the 1950s, this new American painting was the most exciting thing happening in the art world. But to the CIA, this American art movement represented a potential weapon in the fight against communism. The wreckage of World War II left the United States and the Soviet Union as the world's two remaining superpowers, and the tensions that would eventually lead to the Cold War began immediately. The US found itself up against a massive Soviet propaganda machine. This was a war for hearts and minds, and by the late 1940s, a war that the CIA felt they were losing. The Soviets were spending $250 million a year on communist propaganda. And to make it worse, the CIA felt the Soviets had stolen all the best words like freedom, justice, and peace. So the CIA decided to make a massive push to promote American arts and culture. and Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionists would find a special place in the CIA's portfolio. The CIA realized they could use abstract expressionism to highlight the differences between American and Soviet politics. And more specifically, they could highlight the appeal of American culture over Soviet culture. Because in this new war of ideas, the abstract expressionists evoked the most sacred American values: freedom and individualism. The USSR restricted Soviet artists to a single genre: socialist realism. This was an official style of art that idealized communist values and glorified the Soviet working class. The goal of the art was to promote solidarity and party loyalty. All Soviet art had to be realistic and could only portray Soviet life in a favorable light. A former CIA agent named Donald Jameson said, "It was recognized that abstract expressionism was the kind of art that made the Soviet-sanctioned socialist realism look even more stylized and more rigid and confined than it really was, and that this relationship was exploited in some of the exhibitions." Moscow in those days was very vicious in its denunciation of any kind of non-conformity to its own very rigid patterns. And so one could quite adequately and accurately reason that anything they criticized that much and that heavy-handedly was worth support, one way or another. In 1946, the US State Department had created a political firestorm by trying to directly sponsor modern American artists, some of whom turned out to be members of the Communist Party. They then vowed to never again spend taxpayer money on abstract modern art. And so the CIA instead opted for methods that some might have considered morally questionable. Instead of sponsoring American artists directly, as the State Department had done, they secretly helped fund an anti-communist advocacy group called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And through this group, the CIA covertly funneled money to MoMA's international art shows, funded a literary magazine in the UK called Encounter, and operated offices in 35 countries. This entire operation was dubbed Long Leash, and its efforts were designed to target disaffected Soviets, intellectuals, artists, and anyone with communist sympathies. This operation also allowed the CIA to organize and promote art on America's home front. A man named Thomas Braden, MoMA's executive secretary in the 1940s, was hired by the CIA to direct these cultural activities. He created a nexus between the US propaganda machine and the elite New York art world. Braden years later described one of the ways in which money was channeled to the arts. He said, "We would go to somebody in New York who was a well-known rich person, and we would say, 'We want to set up a foundation.' We would tell him what we were actually trying to do and pledge to him secrecy. And he would say, 'Of course I'll do it.' And then you would publish a letterhead, and his name would be on it, and there would be a foundation. It was really a pretty simple device." Ironically, in the 1950s, the CIA was mostly made up of Ivy League graduates who were far more liberal than other government agencies like the FBI. Many of them actually collected art, were versed in contemporary art of the day, and had associations with the Museum of Modern Art, the preeminent modern art museum in the United States. So whereas FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover sought to persecute left-wing artists and intellectuals, the CIA chose to elevate them. The CIA reasoned that coercion would never win hearts and minds. And so the CIA ended up being quite successful anonymous patrons of leftist American artists, throwing several art shows of abstract expressionism in the 1950s through the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And so the CIA found itself fighting the Soviet Union by subverting a large swath of the American political class, as well as the American artists whose careers they were advancing. But the CIA's great invention was to allow the public to believe abstract expressionism was a completely independent, organic phenomenon when it really wasn't.
In 1929, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, the wife of John D. Rockefeller, the wealthiest man in world history, founded the Museum of Modern Art, or the MoMA. From the very beginning, the museum lived up to its name as a bastion of contemporary artistic expression. In 1939, Abby's son, Nelson Rockefeller, became the museum's president. This younger Rockefeller spent much of his life in the public sector, including as FDR's coordinator of inter-American affairs during the Second World War. Rockefeller had to leave the museum early in 1941, but he established a strange precedent. Many of MoMA's highest-ranking employees and board members were Ivy League intellectuals who dabbled in the public sector. Many of them went to school with the politicians in Washington. During the war, the MoMA fulfilled 38 government contracts for borrowing cultural materials and contributed to 19 art exhibitions throughout Latin America. The museum's president declared that the institution had become a weapon for national defense, developing relations with the rest of the Western Hemisphere. With the war's end, the ideological battle with the USSR began. Soviet Russia declared America was a cultural desert devoid of creation, dominated by ugly cars and capitalist tycoons. So the government continued utilizing paintings for propaganda. But the CIA still hadn't been founded. Instead, the State Department created a traveling exhibition called Advancing American Art. In 1946, the department spent $49,000 on 79 paintings by modern American artists like Georgia O'Keeffe and Jacob Lawrence. The show was meant to display the burgeoning creative talent and freedom of artists who went against the mainstream. For foreign critics, it seemed to achieve this goal. The exhibition was praised by reviewers across Europe and the Caribbean, but then it came to an unexpected halt. The popular magazine Look published an expose with the headline, "Your Money Bought These Paintings." The piece looked at the State Department's use of American tax dollars to purchase and parade paintings that most citizens saw as pretentious and worthless. President Truman derided the pictures, claiming that they were not art. The program was shut down, and a new law was established to ensure that the government didn't dabble in such unorthodox industries ever again. That didn't last long, though. The CIA was established in 1947, and its founding father, William Paley, sat on MoMA's board. One of the most essential branches of the agency was the International Organizations Division, the IOD, led by Tom Braden, MoMA's executive secretary. This division had some unorthodox goals, sending art and symphonies abroad, publishing magazines in Europe, and other uses of culture to win European hearts and minds. The CIA was already attracting the nation's cultural elite, but the IOD was staffed almost entirely by Harvard and Yale grads who collected paintings and wrote fiction in their spare time. The group must have had good taste, because they realized immediately that the New York School of Abstract Expressionism could be utilized for maximum effect. The artists themselves mostly detested the government, so the CIA had to operate from a distance, but they had a plan for that called the Long Leash. The agency created the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a Europe-based organization for promoting American culture and ideology. The CIA funded and managed the organization, but most employees never knew of the government's involvement. At its height, the CCF had offices in 35 countries and controlled more than 24 popular magazines. Paired with their cozy relationship with MoMA, the CIA could dominate the art world. The partnership worked like this. The CCF would decide to put together a traveling exhibit. The three major ones throughout the 1950s were the masterpieces of the 20th century, modern art in the United States, and the new American painting. The CCF didn't own any paintings, nor did they have the financial resources to transport them, so they would need a wealthy backer with an extensive collection. Thankfully, Nelson Rockefeller wholeheartedly sympathized with their cause. Once exhibitions began, the art critics at CCF magazines praised the American form. Europeans crowded into museums to catch a glance at de Kooning's latest masterpieces. In 1966, though, it all came to an end. The American public and news media were already suspicious of the CIA. In 1966, the New York Times published a series of articles detailing the CIA's efforts to influence the free press in the United States. The reports described the false front organizations funded by the agency and exposed the countless publications that were run by CIA people. When the dust settled, nobody knew just how involved the CIA was in the abstract expressionist movement. But it didn't matter. With its long leash, the CIA controlled more than 800 publications across the world, many on American soil. These weren't radical right-wing papers either. They represented all sides of the political spectrum, including magazines read by communists and socialists. To sum it up, the CIA had made the free press decidedly unfree. This led to a series of Senate hearings and public debates about the role that the CIA should play in society. One thing that everyone agreed on was that they didn't want to read papers run by the agency. The CCF was shut down and the IOD was repurposed, bringing a sudden end to the CIA's involvement in fine art. CIA agents stood by their decisions. Tom Braden published an article entitled, "I'm glad the CIA is immoral," arguing that these questionable actions were all justified in the war against communism. Of course, at the time, no one had any idea just how deep CIA involvement went. Despite all of the exposure, the agency's role in promoting abstract expressionism remained unclear. While financing traveling art shows is about the most virtuous thing the CIA has ever done, the decision was clearly dripping in hypocrisy. In the push to show just how intellectually free Americans were, the CIA violated the world's intellectual freedom by manipulating the press to boost their own art.
Let's take a trip back in time. But before we kill baby Hitler, let's make a quick stop in the Cold War. The first one. This remake we're living in is really cheap. They're not even trying. In the original Cold War, the CIA went all out. They even infiltrated the modern art scene to promote anti-communists. It's just like a great man once said, good artists copy, great artists become pawns in a globalized war for American dominance. This is not finger paint. This is Pollock's drip method. Kind of makes me think of cocaine, which the CIA was also funding at the time. They called this the symbol of political freedom because it eliminated any recognizable subject matter while promoting the artist's self-discovery. And in Central America, the CIA eliminated any recognizable self-government. They created more of an abstract government. Yeah, we don't have time for concrete events like the war we're in. There are still 57 more interpretations of this Pollock we have to get to. And it's not only fine art. The CIA sponsored hundreds of Hollywood films, from a rewrite of Animal Farm to make its message more overtly anti-communist, to helping produce Zero Dark 30 in 2012. Freedom isn't free. You have to pay $14.69 to receive it through George Clooney's piercing eyes. The exhibit in Berlin shows how America corrupted the concept of freedom. Europe is always coming to terms with its past just to make us look bad. An exhibit at the John Jay School for Criminal Justice tries to do the same in the US, and of course they fail. Ode to the Sea, Art from Guantanamo, showcases work by detainees at the prison. Even though only one of the Guantanamo painters is facing charges and 2 have been released, we're calling them all suspected terrorists. Then, after years of letting captives own their artwork, the Pentagon calls it US property. Because important tenets of American law are, of course, habeas corpus and findus keepus. But the government should suppress these images because who knows what dangerous ideas people will think when they see glasses, cups, waves, and rowboats. These paintings were inspected for hidden messages and then approved for export by authorities. But one top-secret message present in all the pieces snuck by them, that its makers were human beings. A pernicious idea which, if bought by the American people, strips justification for illegal torture facilities. It seems clear that art can be dangerous, so please send all your art to the CIA, even those macaroni necklaces, to make sure it's acceptable for our weak American minds. Reporting from Berlin, this is Naomi Caravani.
They make headlines for all 4 seasons, different reasons. They make headlines on those 3 networks, they're together. Though the stories are much different, they will tell them like they all are strangers acting alone. Get away, get away, get away, get away, away from my food. Whoa. Get away, get away, get away, get away. I was here first. It's just me. There is a wake in the night. There is no danger. Their audience of big clubs. That's how they feel. They write headlines, it makes them angry when we don't watch. They write headlines, they will write so far, fix those losers. Independent flow of news does not follow our ways. They listen to strangers, not to our truth. Go away, go away, go away, go away.
is green. See the other side, not caught up, waiting for a thing, waiting for when the moment is right. Until then we know
They make headlines, Rhonda can't hold down till she's sold out. They make headlines, she fills the adverts, she subverts them with her lover. On the sports page, they can't vent their anger, since she is a stranger and he stands alone. Hide away, hide away, hide away, hide away. We will strike down. Whoa. Get away, get away, get away, get away, till there's a shot. And yes, they feel their duty is true. They feel no danger, trying to show other side. There's a B and C. They make headlines.
Because what I make clear is that what the Congress for Cultural Freedom represented was a serious alliance of intellectuals. Leave aside the institutional, CIA background for a minute. Committed to preserving high modernist achievements. They were not people who enjoyed, as the writings of all of these individuals even now will show very clearly, who enjoyed anything of mass culture. They did not like Elvis, they did not like blue jeans. You know what one of their biggest fears was? If you read Irving Kristol now, one of his major fears was not that, people weren't going to read Encounter magazine or that the Soviets were going to nuke us or we were going to nuke them. It was that, Elvis and blue jeans were going to win the Cold War. And that meant that even if it was an American or non-Soviet victory, that, those elite, high cultural values and ideas would not have won. And that's essentially what has happened. This was a kind of, at one level, an incredibly heroic battle to try and defend high culture from the threat, not just of mass man in the totalitarian Soviet Union sense, but, the famous ooze of mass culture in the Dwight McDonald, it's here in America sense. So it was kind of a domestic battle there as well as just the dread and the justified dread of the Soviet paradigm being imposed in terms of culture. It was evident here right before their very eyes and noses, and this is something that they write about compellingly now. This seems to be the real guiding project of their lives. Actually, is this action against the sort of breaking of the floodgates, and the Philistines are inside. It was not just about opposing the Soviets. It was about also creating a groundswell of approval and asserting the merits of American culture in the post-war era. If you have an enormous imperial burden, which America had, which it had acquired in the aftermath of the Second World War, you need a culture to go with it. I mean, I think that's not I think it's just instinctive. This is what happens. The CIA and the Ford Foundation, among other agencies, had set up and were financing an apparatus of intellectuals selected for their correct Cold War positions as an alternative to what one might call a free intellectual market, where ideology was presumed to count for less than individual talent and achievement, and where doubts about established orthodoxies were taken to be the beginning of all inquiry. It had at last become clear how bad a bargain the intellectuals had made, that it could never have been in the interest of art or literature, of serious speculation of any kind, or even of humanity itself, for them to serve the will of any nation. It will perhaps be another 50 years before we discover whether the CIA still exerts influence over the cultural affairs of this and indeed other nations. On the lobby wall of the CIA's headquarters at Langley, Virginia, is engraved this from St. John's Gospel: "The truth shall make you free." It's time it did.
Saint Ra, whose helpers are so many, influential talking heads, flatterers and sycophants. Saint Ra, no mercy granted any, sent from Hades, serve the workers of the plan. What's a bureaucrat to do but steal, embezzle all the loot with fanatical zeal? What's a bureaucrat to do but steal? Saint Ra, whose wealth is far from empty, hires for peanuts violent men, carry out the discipline. Saint Ra, no mercy granted any, sent from Hades, serve the workers of the plan. What's a bureaucrat to do but steal, embezzle all the loot with fanatical zeal? What's a bureaucrat to do but steal? What's a bureaucrat to do but steal, embezzle all the loot with fanatical zeal? What's a bureaucrat to do but steal? Ice road truckers, I welcome you today for the age. Help us now. Help us now. Saint Ra, whose helpers are so many, empty suits and soft showmen, all obedient unto death. Saint Ra, no mercy granted any, sent from Hades, serve the workers of the plan. What's a bureaucrat to do but steal, embezzle all the loot with fanatical zeal? What's a bureaucrat to do but steal? What's a bureaucrat to do but steal, embezzle all the loot with fanatical zeal? What's a bureaucrat to do but steal? Ice road truckers, I welcome you today. Letter H, help us now. Help us now.
We'll do it live! Fuck it!